After my son died, his wife stood over his body and smiled, not a smile of grief, but the smile of a predator who had just taken down big game. Now that the money bag is dead, she whispered to her fitness trainer, I am going to inherit $500 million, and that old man will be left with nothing but empty pockets. She rejoiced as if she had won the lottery, moving her boyfriend into my house before the funeral service was even over. But she forgot one thing. You cannot inherit what was never his to begin with. When the lawyer entered the room to read the will, he did not look at her. He looked at me. Tiffany, you might want to sit down, he said coldly. You are not the beneficiary. You are the liability. Before I tell you how a single sentence destroyed her entire world, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand alone against a storm of betrayal. My name is Augustus King, and I am 72 years old. Yesterday was the hardest day of my life, not because I lost my fortune, but because I had to say goodbye to my only son, Dante. The funeral was held at the most expensive chapel in the city, a place that looked more like a hotel lobby than a house of God. It was cold, sterile, and filled with white lilies that smelled like formaldehyde and money. This was Tiffany Represents doing, of course. She wanted a spectacle. She wanted the press there. She wanted the world to see her in her designer black veil, playing the role of the grieving widow. I stood in the corner of the room, leaning on my cane, watching the circus. Dante would have hated this. He was a quiet man, a man of science and code, who preferred the hum of a server room to the flash of a camera. But Dante was gone, and now his image belonged to her. The room was packed with people who didn't know him, business partners eager to see who would take over the company, social climbers looking for gossip. And in the center of it all, Tiffany holding court. She was 30 years old, beautiful in a sharp, dangerous way, and her eyes were completely dry. She accepted condolences like she was accepting awards, nodding, clutching the arms of strangers, but never once looking at the casket. I waited until the crowd began to thin, until the reception line moved toward the exit. I wanted one moment, just one moment, to say goodbye to my boy. I walked slowly toward the open casket, my legs heavy, my heart feeling like a stone in my chest. I looked down at Dante. He looked peaceful, but too thin. The stress of the last few years, the relentless pressure Tiffany put on him to earn more, to buy more, had eaten him alive. He was 40 years old, but he looked older than me. I reached out my trembling hand, wanting to touch his cheek one last time, wanting to feel the cold reality of his skin, to believe that he was really gone. Just as my fingertips were inches from his face, a hand shot out and struck my wrist. It wasn't a gentle stop. It was a slap, sharp and violent. I recoiled, looking up into the blazing blue eyes of Tiffany. She was standing there, flanked by Kyle, her personal trainer, a man who had been lingering around my son Represents house for months. She didn't look sad. She looked furious. Don't touch him, she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper, meant only for me. Do not put your old rough hands on him. You will dirty the suit. That is a $5,000 Italian custom fit, and I need him to look perfect for the photos. Get back. Augustus, you have done enough. I stood there stunned. The sting on my wrist was nothing compared to the sting in my soul. This was my son. I had changed his diapers. I had taught him how to build his first model airplane. I had sat by his bedside when he had the measles. And now this woman, this stranger who had only known him for 5 years, was telling me I wasn't allowed to say goodbye because I might ruin the aesthetic. I looked at Kyle, hoping for some decency, hoping he would tell her to stop. But Kyle just smirked. He was a tall, muscular man with bleached teeth and the kind of arrogance that comes from never having to work for anything. He put a possessive hand on Tiffany Represents' shoulder and looked at me with pure disdain. Listen to the lady, old man, Kyle said, chuckling softly. Step back. The VIP section is closed. I wanted to scream. I wanted to raise my cane and strike them both down right there in the house of God. But I remembered who I was. I am Augustus King. I am an engineer. I spent 40 years calculating trajectories and stress points for aerospace engines. I know that when you are facing a structural failure, you don't hit it with a hammer. You find the weak point and you wait. So I didn't say a word. I just lowered my hand and stepped back. My eyes, fixing on Dante, represents body one last time. And that is when I saw it. Dante represents. Left hand was resting on his chest. His sleeve had pulled back slightly, revealing his wrist. It was bare. My breath caught in my throat. For 20 years, Dante had never taken off the watch I gave him when he graduated from MIT. It was a Patek Philippe, a vintage piece that had taken me 5 years of savings to buy. It was our bond, our symbol of time and legacy. He wore it to every board meeting, every product launch. He told me once, "Dad, this watch reminds me that time is the only thing we can't earn back." He was buried in a $5,000 suit, but the one thing that actually meant something to him was missing. I looked up, my eyes scanning the room frantically. Had the undertaker stolen it? Had Tiffany sold it already? And then my gaze landed on Kyle. He was adjusting his cufflinks, laughing at something. Tiffany whispered in his ear as he moved his arm. The light from the chandelier caught a flash of gold on his wrist. The world seemed to stop spinning. The noise of the room faded into a dull roar, leaving only the thumping of my own heart in my ears. There it was, my watch. My son represents watch, the Patek Philippe, with the inscription on the back that read, "To Dante, my North Star love. Dad." It was sitting on the wrist of the man who was sleeping with my son, represents wife, while my son represents body, was still warm. The disrespect was so absolute, so total, that it almost brought me to my knees. This wasn't just theft. This was a declaration of war. They weren't just taking. Dante represents money. They were erasing his memory. They were stripping his corpse and wearing his legacy like a trophy. Tiffany saw me looking. She followed my gaze to Kyle. Represents wrist, and for a second, just a split second, she looked surprised. But then a slow, cruel smile spread across her face. She didn't try to hide it. She didn't tell Kyle to cover it up. She lifted her chin, challenging me, daring me to make a scene, daring the old black man to accuse the wealthy white widow of theft. I looked at the watch, then I looked at Tiffany. I didn't blink. My eyes, usually warm and tired, went dark, cold, and hard like the steel I used to work with. I didn't say a word. I didn't point. I didn't call the police, not yet. They thought I was defeated. They thought I was a senile old man who would go back to his room and cry. But they forgot that before I was an old man, I was a man who solved impossible problems. And this problem standing in front of me, wearing my son, represents stolen time, was not impossible. It was just a variable that needed to be eliminated. I turned around and walked away from the casket, the tap of my cane on the marble floor sounding like the countdown of a clock. I walked out of the funeral home into the blinding afternoon sun, leaving my son behind with the wolves. But as I stepped into the light, I made a promise to the wind. "Dante," I whispered, "they took your time, but they will not take your dignity. The clock is ticking. Tiffany. But this time, it is ticking for you." The ride back from the cemetery was a masterclass in suffocation. We sat in the back of the black stretched limousine, separated by 3 feet of leather seat and an ocean of hatred. Tiffany was busy on her phone, scrolling through the comments on her latest social media post about the funeral. She was checking the engagement metrics of her grief, counting the likes as if they were dollars. I sat looking out the tinted window, watching the gray city roll by, feeling the absence of my son like a phantom limb. The silence in the car wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a bomb waiting to detonate. When the car pulled up to the iron gates of the King estate, the house that my son had bought 3 years ago looked different. It didn't look like a home anymore. It looked like a fortress that had been captured by enemy forces. The gargoyles on the gate seemed to be laughing at me, mocking the old man who was returning to a castle where he was no longer the king, but the prisoner. The driver opened the door, and I stepped out, my cane clicking against the cobblestone driveway. Tiffany swept past me, her black heels clacking sharply. She didn't wait for me. She didn't hold the door. She walked into the house as if she were marching into battle, and I was the target. I followed her inside the heavy oak door, closing behind us, shutting out the world, shutting out the light. I walked toward the living room, intending to sit in my favorite armchair, the worn leather wingback where Dante and I used to play chess on Sunday evenings. But before I could take a step, I heard a sound from the top of the stairs. It was a dragging sound followed by a heavy rhythmic thumping. Thump, thump, thump. I looked up. Tiffany was standing on the landing, struggling with a large brown object. She gave it a final violent shove, and it came tumbling down the stairs, crashing onto the marble floor at my feet with a sickening crack. It was my suitcase. Not a new one, but the old leather Samsonite I had carried with me since my days at Boeing. The latch had popped open, spilling my shirts and my engineering journals across the foyer like entrails. I looked at the mess, then I looked up at her. She was standing there with her hands on her hips, looking down at me like I was an insect she had just stepped on. "What is the meaning of this?" "Tiffany?" I asked, my voice low and steady, forcing the tremor out of my hands. "It means, get out," she said. Her voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was loud, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Dante is dead, Augustus. And with him died the only reason I tolerated your presence in this house." She walked down the stairs slowly, enjoying every step, enjoying the elevation she had over me. "I don't have an obligation to support you anymore," she continued, stopping on the bottom step so she could still look down on me. "You were Dante, represents charity case. You were the old relic he kept around out of guilt. Well, I don't have guilt. Augustus, I have bills, and I am not running a nursing home." I looked at my clothes scattered on the floor, my journals. The ones filled with sketches of turbine engines and flight dynamics were splayed open, vulnerable. I bent down to pick one up, but she kicked it away. Her sharp heel tore the cover. "Leave it," she snapped. "You can pack it up when you leave. You have 24 hours, Augustus. 24 hours to find a bridge to sleep under or a shelter that takes in strays. But you are not staying here." "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, looking her in the eye. "This is my son represents house. He told me I would always have a home here." "He lied," she spat. "Or maybe he just forgot to ask his wife. You see, Augustus, this is prime real estate, and your room, the one with the view of the garden, the one you spend all day reading in, that room is gone." She smiled, a cruel twisting of her red lips. "Kyle needs a home gym," he says. "The lighting in your room is perfect for his morning selfies. So tomorrow morning the contractors are coming to rip out that dusty carpet and those ugly bookshelves. We are putting in mirrors and weights. So unless you want to be a barbell rack, you need to be gone." The mention of Kyle made my stomach turn. It was one thing to be evicted. It was another to be replaced by the man who was disrespecting my son represents memory before the dirt had even settled on his grave. "Speaking of the devil," a voice boomed from the living room. Kyle walked in. He was wearing a silk robe. My son represents silk robe, the one Dante wore on Sunday mornings while drinking coffee. Kyle had it open to his waist, showing off his chest, swinging a crystal wine glass in his hand. He looked at the scene in the foyer, the spilled clothes, the angry widow, the old man, and he laughed. "Honey, you didn't have to throw his panties on the floor," he said, walking over to Tiffany and wrapping an arm around her waist. "I could have tossed him out for you. Would have been good cardio." I looked at the glass in his hand. It was filled with a deep ruby liquid. I knew that color. It was a Chateau Margaux, 1982. Dante had bought that bottle at an auction for his 40th birthday. He was saving it for a special occasion. He was saving it for the day he retired. "You are drinking his wine," I said, my voice dropping an octave. That bottle was for his retirement. Kyle took a long, loud sip, smacking his lips exaggeratedly. "Well, I guess he retired early, didn't he, old man, so I am drinking it for him. Cheers to Dante, thanks for the robe, buddy. It is a little tight in the shoulders, but it breathes well." The rage that flared in my chest was blinding. It was a white-hot heat that made my vision blur. I gripped my cane so hard the wood creaked. I wanted to swing it. I wanted to smash that glass into his smiling face and wipe the arrogance off his soul. But I stood still. I am an engineer. I know that an uncontrolled explosion destroys the engine. You have to channel the pressure. You have to wait for the ignition point. Tiffany leaned into Kyle, giggling like a schoolgirl watching a bully torment the class nerd. "Look at him, Kyle. He doesn't know what to do. He thinks he still owns the place." Kyle looked at me, his eyes narrowing. He took another sip of the wine, and then he said the words that burned the bridge. "Forever. You know you should be grateful." "Back, Tom," he drawled, using the slur with a casual ease that showed he had used it many times before. "We are giving you a whole day to pack. Most people would have just changed the locks. You have had a good run, living off your rich son, pretending you were somebody. But let us be real. You are just the help that stayed too long." And now the masters of the house are tired of you, Uncle Tom. The slur hung in the air, heavy and toxic. He called me Uncle Tom, a man who had marched in Selma, a man who had broken barriers in the aerospace industry. When people like Kyle were still learning to spell their own names, he reduced my entire life, my dignity, my struggle to a racist caricature of subservience. I looked at Tiffany, expecting her to correct him, expecting her to have some shred of respect for the father of her late husband. But she just smirked, drinking in the insult, enjoying my humiliation. Right, she said, listen to him. Augustus Kyle is the man of the house now, and he wants you gone. So start packing. I looked at them both. The white woman who had married my son for his wallet and the white man she had brought in to spend it. They stood there, framed by the opulence my son had built, thinking they were the victors. They thought power was a loud voice in a silk robe. They didn't know that power is silence, power is memory, power is a plan. I bent down slowly, my knees popping in the quiet hallway, and I began to place my shirts back into the suitcase. I folded them neatly, smoothing out the wrinkles. I picked up my journals, dusting off the footprint Tiffany had left on the cover. I didn't look at them. I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing a tear or hearing a plea. I stood up, closing the suitcase with a solid click. I adjusted my hat and looked at Kyle. Enjoy the wine, I said quietly. My voice was steady, dry as dust. It has a bitter aftertaste if you don't let it breathe long enough, but I suppose you wouldn't know that. Kyle stopped smiling for a second, confused by my calm. He expected a fight. He expected begging. My dignity confused him. I walked to the door, dragging the suitcase behind me. The wheels rumbled on the marble, echoing like distant thunder. "Where are you going?" Tiffany called out, suddenly annoyed that her drama had been cut short. "You have 24 hours. You don't have to leave now. You can sleep in the basement if you want." I opened the heavy oak door, letting the evening air rush in. It smelled of rain and freedom. "No, thank you," I said without turning back. "I prefer to sleep where the air is clean. I will send for the rest of my things." I walked out of the house, leaving the door open. Just a crack. I heard Kyle laugh again, calling me a crazy old coot, but his laughter sounded hollow. I walked down the long driveway, my cane tapping a rhythm on the stone. 1, 2, 3. I wasn't walking away from my home. I was walking toward my war room. They had 24 hours to celebrate. I had 24 hours to calculate the trajectory of their destruction. And unlike them, I never miss. I looked at Kyle, represents smirk. And I looked at Tiffany, represents impatient glare. They wanted a fight. They wanted me to scream and refuse to leave so they could call the police and drag me out in handcuffs. It would be the perfect ending to their day, a final humiliation to cement their victory. But I am an engineer, and I know that you do not engage the enemy when you are out of ammunition. You retreat, you regroup, and you find the structural weakness in their defenses. "Fine," I said, my voice sounding defeated and small. "I will go. I need to gather my strength. It is late, and my legs are not what they used to be. Can I just sleep in the basement tonight? Just one night. I will be gone before you wake up in the morning." Tiffany rolled her eyes, letting out a dramatic sigh as if my breathing air in her house was a personal affront. "Fine," she snapped, pointing a manicured finger at the floor. "Just tonight, and stay down there. I don't want to see you wandering the halls like a ghost. Use the service entrance tomorrow when you leave. Don't let the neighbors see you dragging that trashy suitcase down the front steps." I nodded, lowering my head in mock submission. "Thank you," I whispered. I took my suitcase and walked toward the narrow door under the stairs, the one that led to the unfinished basement. It was a dark, damp space, filled with the hum of the furnace and the smell of old concrete. But as I closed the door behind me and heard the lock click from the outside, Tiffany locking me in like a dog, my posture changed. I straightened my back. I set the suitcase down gently on a workbench. My hands stopped shaking. The old man act was over. I sat on a folding chair in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house above me. I could hear their footsteps, heavy and careless. I could hear the pop of a cork and the clinking of glasses. They were celebrating my eviction, drinking my son represents wine and laughing about the $500 million they thought they had just secured. They thought I was down here crying into my pillow. They didn't know that I knew this house better than they did. I had designed the security system for Dante 5 years ago. Tiffany thought locking the basement door was enough. but she didn't know about the maintenance override code I had programmed into the keypad just in case of a fire. She didn't know that the basement had a ventilation shaft that ran directly behind the wall of Dante Represents Home office. I waited until 2 in the morning. The footsteps upstairs had stopped. The laughter had died down, replaced by the silence of expensive sleep. I moved the loose panel in the drywall, the one hidden behind the water heater, and slipped into the narrow service corridor. It was a tight squeeze for a man of 72, but rage is a powerful lubricant. I climbed the service ladder, wincing as my bad knee protested, but I didn't stop. I emerged into the utility closet on the second floor. The house was silent, wrapped in shadows. I walked softly down the hallway toward the master suite. The door was open slightly, and I could hear the rhythmic snoring of Kyle. He was sleeping in my son represents bed, dreaming of spending my son represents money. I felt a surge of bile rise in my throat, but I pushed it down. I wasn't here for revenge. Not yet. I was here for answers. I slipped into Dante Represents Home office across the hall. It was a cold, sterile room filled with glass and chrome. Tiffany had decorated it. She wanted it to look like the office of a billionaire, not the workspace of an engineer. There were no photos of family, only awards and framed magazine covers. I sat down at Dante Represents desk. The leather chair still held the faint shape of his body. I touched the cold surface of his computer monitor. It was locked, of course, biometrics and passwords. Tiffany had probably already tried to hack it and failed. She was greedy, but she wasn't smart. She didn't know that Dante Represents Mind was a reflection of mine. I looked at the password hint. It was a single question. What is the variable for lift? I smiled, a sad, broken smile. It was the first lesson I ever taught him about aerodynamics when he was 6 years old. L equals C. L times half, rho, V squared, S. Most people would type the formula. But Dante wasn't most people. He knew the emotional variable. I typed in the word hope. The screen flashed green and unlocked. Access granted. I didn't look at the bank accounts. I didn't look at the stock options. I went straight to the folder labeled personal logs. Dante was a meticulous man, documented everything. It was a habit from his coding days, keeping a log of bugs and system failures, only this time the system failure was his life. I opened the most recent video file. It was dated 3 days before he died. The video opened and I had to cover my mouth to stop a scream from escaping. Dante was sitting in this very chair, but he looked like a ghost. His skin was gray. His eyes were sunken into dark hollow sockets and his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his coffee cup. He looked terrified. Log entry 412. Dante whispered, his voice raspy and weak. It is 3 a.m. Tiffany just came in. She screamed at me for 2 hours. She wants the yacht, the one with the helipad. She says, if I don't sign the purchase order by Friday, she will release the photos. He paused, taking a ragged breath. She knows about the accounting error in Q3. It was a mistake. A clerical error, but she says she will frame it as embezzlement. She says she will destroy the stock price. She will destroy the company Dad built. She says I have to work harder. She says 500 million isn't enough. She needs 1 billion. I clicked on the next video dated 2 days later. Dante was crying. He was clutching his chest, rubbing his left arm. I can't feel my fingers, he said to the camera. My chest hurts all the time now. Dr. Evans told me I need rest. He told me my blood pressure is critical, but she won't let me sleep. She comes in every hour to check if I am working. She brought Kyle over today. They sat on the sofa and watched me code, laughing. She called me her little gold miner. She said, if I die, she wins either way. My tears were falling freely now, hot and angry, onto the glass desk. This wasn't a stroke. This wasn't natural causes. This was murder. Murder by stress. Murder by extortion. She had worked him to death like a mule, whipping him until his heart simply gave out. And she did it while holding a gun to his head, not a metal gun, but a gun made of shame and reputation. I opened the final file. It was just audio dated the morning he died. Dad. Dante Represents voice was barely a whisper. If you are listening to this, I am sorry. I was weak. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want to disappoint you. She threatened to tell the press that you were the one who made the mistake in the code. She threatened to ruin your name. I couldn't let her do that. So I stayed. But I can't do it anymore. I think my heart is stopping. I love you, Dad. You were always my North Star. The audio ended with the sound of a heavy thud. the sound of my son hitting the floor. I sat there in the silence, the hum of the computer fan sounding like a scream in my ears. I looked at the time. It was 4 a.m. Upstairs, the woman who had killed my son was sleeping soundly next to her lover, believing she had gotten away with the perfect crime. She thought Dante died of a weak heart. She didn't know he died of a broken one, protecting me. I pulled a USB drive from my pocket. My hands were steady now, steadier than they had been in years. The grief had crystallized into something harder, something sharper. I copied every single log, every email, every text message where she threatened him. I downloaded the medical reports she had hidden. The ones proving she ignored the doctor represents warnings. This wasn't just evidence for a lawsuit. This was the map of her destruction. I wiped my fingerprints from the keyboard. I closed the files, leaving the computer exactly as I had found it, locked and silent. I stood up and looked around the room one last time. "I am not disappointed, son," I whispered to the empty air. "I am not disappointed that you fell. I am only sorry I wasn't there to catch you. But I am here now, and I promise you the monster who did this will not just lose the money. She is going to lose her freedom." I slipped back into the hallway. The floorboards didn't creak. I moved like a shadow, a phantom in the house of my enemy. I climbed back down the service ladder and returned to the basement, locking the secret panel behind me. I laid down on the folding chair, but I didn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, visualizing the structure of Tiffany represents life. I saw the load-bearing walls of her greed, the support beams of her vanity, and the foundation of her lies. I had the blueprints now. Tomorrow morning, I would leave this house with my head down, playing the part of the defeated old man. I would let her laugh, I would let her throw my suitcase, I would let her think she had won, because the higher she climbed, the harder she would fall, and I, Augustus King, was going to be the one to cut the rope. The sun was barely up when I walked out of the heavy iron gates of the King estate for the last time. The morning mist was clinging to the manicured lawns, wrapping the gargoyles in a gray shroud that matched the color of my spirit. My old suitcase rumbled behind me on the cobblestones, a rhythmic clatter that sounded like dry bones rattling in a box. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't need to. I knew Tiffany was watching from the master bedroom window, probably sipping her morning espresso, waiting to make sure the trash took itself out. She wanted a show. She wanted to see a broken old man defeated by her brilliance. So I gave it to her. I hunched my shoulders, I dragged my left leg a little more than necessary, and I stopped at the gate to wipe a fake tear from my eye, but as soon as the heavy gates clicked shut behind me and I turned the corner onto the main road, my posture changed. I straightened my spine, I gripped my cane, not for support, but like a weapon. I wasn't leaving town, I wasn't going to a shelter, and I certainly wasn't going to crawl into a hole and die. I walked 3 blocks down the hill to a small brick apartment complex that faced the rear entrance of the estate. It was a rundown building, the kind with peeling paint and windows that stuck in their frames, but it had one feature that was worth more than gold. A direct line of sight into Dante, represents home office. I had rented the unit 3 months ago under a fake name. It was supposed to be a storage space for my engineering journals, a place to work on my patents in peace. Away from Tiffany represents constant complaining, but now it was my command center, my cockpit. I set my suitcase down on the dusty floor and walked to the window, pulling out a pair of high-powered binoculars. I focused the lenses, adjusting the variable until the blurry shape of the mansion sharpened into crystal clarity. I could see the balcony, I could see the garden, and I could see Kyle walking out onto the terrace. In my sun represents robe, stretching like a cat in the sun. The first shot of the war was fired at noon. I went to the pharmacy on 4th Street, the same one I had been using for 20 years to pick up my blood pressure medication. The pharmacist. Mrs. Gable smiled at me when I walked in, but her smile faltered when she looked at her computer screen. "Augustus," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "there is a problem with your insurance. It is coming up as terminated." "Terminated," I repeated calmly, leaning on the counter, checking the perimeter of my emotions. "Yes," she said, looking confused. "It says the policy was canceled by the primary account holder at 9 this morning. The note says..." She hesitated, her face turning pink. The note says, "Dependent, no longer eligible due to non-residency. Augustus, this medication is expensive, out of pocket. It is $300 a month. I looked at her kind face and I felt the cold calculation of Tiffany represents move. She knew I had hypertension. She knew that without these pills I was at risk of a stroke. She wasn't just kicking me out. She was trying to kill me. She was cutting my supply lines, hoping nature would do the dirty work so she wouldn't have blood on her manicured hands. I pulled out my wallet. My hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from a rage so potent it felt like gasoline in my veins. I paid in cash. Mrs. Gable counting out the bills I had saved from my pension. "Keep the change," I told her. "And Mrs. Gable, if anyone asks, I didn't pick these up. Tell them I couldn't afford it. Tell them I walked away empty-handed. I walked out of the pharmacy and pulled out my phone. I dialed Tiffany represents number, knowing exactly what would happen. It rang once then, a sharp click, and a mechanical voice informed me that the subscriber was not accepting calls. She had blocked me. She had erased me. She wanted me to feel isolated, desperate, and alone. She wanted me to panic. But panic is a variable. I eliminated from my system a long time ago instead of panicking. I called Thurgood Mosley. Thurgood has been my lawyer and my friend since we were the only two black faces in our graduating class at the state university. He met me at a diner on the edge of town, a place where the coffee was strong and the booths were deep enough to hide secrets. Thurgood looked older than I remembered, his hair white as cotton, but his eyes were still sharp, intelligent, and currently filled with a simmering anger. He listened as I told him about the funeral, the watch, the eviction, and the canceled insurance. He didn't interrupt. He just gripped his coffee cup tighter until his knuckles turned gray. "She is trying to provoke you, Augustus," Thurgood said, his voice a low rumble. "She wants you to lash out. She wants you to do something violent or stupid so she can get a restraining order. She wants to paint you as the angry, ungrateful father-in-law so she can play the victim when the will is read." "I know," I said, slicing my eggs with surgical precision. "That is why I am staying quiet. That is why I am letting her think she won." "But Thurgood, we need to talk about the will." "I know. Dante left everything to her. I know the law. But there has to be a loophole." Thurgood reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. He placed it on the table, covering it with his hand. "Augustus, you know, Dante was a brilliant coder, right? He thought in algorithms. If this, then that." He applied the same logic to his estate planning. I leaned forward, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "What are you saying?" Thurgood looked around the diner, ensuring no one was listening. "Dante came to see me 2 months ago. He was scared. Augustus. He knew his health was failing. He knew Tiffany was pressuring him. He suspected she was having an affair, but he didn't have the proof. He was trapped. If he divorced her, she threatened to release confidential company data that would ruin the stock price. So he wrote a second will." "A second will," I whispered. "A conditional will," Thurgood corrected. "It is a masterpiece of legal engineering. The primary will, the one Tiffany knows about, leaves everything to her absolutely. But this document," Thurgood tapped the envelope, "is the override code. It states that if Dante dies under suspicious circumstances, or if his widow displays gross moral turpitude within 30 days of his death, the primary will is null and void." "Gross moral turpitude," I repeated, testing the weight of the phrase. "It is a legal term," Thurgood explained. "It means behavior that is vile, base, or depraved. It means acting without conscience." Dante listed specific triggers. If she denies his father housing, if she cuts off medical care, if she cohabitates with another man in the marital home before the estate is settled. If she does any of these things within 30 days, the assets do not go to her. They revert to the residual beneficiary. "And who is the residual beneficiary?" I asked. Thurgood smiled, and for the first time that day I saw a glimpse of the young man who used to debate civil rights with me in the dorm room. "You are Augustus, but not just you. The estate reverts to the original founder. We will get to that part later. The important thing is the trigger. We need proof. We need her to cross the line so clearly that no judge in America can side with her." "She already crossed it," I said. My voice was hard. "She moved Kyle in yesterday. She threw my clothes in the street. She cut my insurance today." Thurgood shook his head. "It is not enough, Augustus. Not for $500 million. For that kind of money, she will hire an army of lawyers. They will say Kyle is a grief counselor. They will say you moved out voluntarily. They will say the insurance was a clerical error. We need more. We need her to feel so safe, so victorious that she stops pretending. We need her to be cruel. Publicly, undeniably cruel. I understood the mission instantly. It was a stress test in engineering. When you want to certify an engine, you run it at maximum power until it breaks. You push it past the red line, you heat it up, you deny it. Oil. We needed to do the same to Tiffany. We needed to feed her ego until it burst. So I have to play the victim, I said. I have to be the old horse put out to pasture. Exactly, Thurgood said, leaning back. You have to let her humiliate you. You have to let her think you are destitute, broken, and begging. You have to make her believe that the money is hers, and you are nothing but a nuisance. If she thinks she has won, she will get careless. She will start spending. She will start bragging. And that is when we catch her. I thought about the Patek Philippe on Kyle Represents wrist. I thought about my son dying alone in that cold office, terrified of the woman he slept next to. I thought about the indignity of hiding in a rundown apartment watching my own home through binoculars. It went against every fiber of my being. I am a proud man. I have worked hard for every scrap of respect I have earned. Asking me to bow my head to a woman like Tiffany was like asking a lion to eat grass. But then I remembered Dante Represents' voice in the log files. She said, "If I die, she wins either way." No, son, I thought, she doesn't win. I looked at Thurgood and nodded slowly. I will do it, I said. I will be the old horse. I will let her ride me into the ground. But Thurgood, when the 30 days are up, I want the saddle off, and I want to be the one who closes the gate. Thurgood slid the envelope back into his briefcase. Consider it done. The reading of the will is scheduled for 3 weeks from today. That gives her 21 days to hang herself. You just need to give her the rope. I left the diner and walked back to my observation post. The sun was high now, beating down on the pavement. My leg ached, but I didn't slow down. I climbed the stairs to my apartment and went straight to the window. I picked up the binoculars. Across the street, Tiffany was by the pool. She was wearing a black bikini, holding a glass of champagne, laughing at something Kyle was doing. He was splashing water at her carefree and vibrant living, the life my son had paid for with his blood. Laugh while you can, I whispered, zooming in until her smiling face filled my vision. I picked up my phone and dialed her number again, knowing she wouldn't answer, knowing it was blocked. But I needed to leave a digital trail of my desperation. I needed the phone records to show that her father-in-law had called, and she had ignored him. I sat down in the dusty chair and began to plan. My first move would be the bank. I would ask for a loan, knowing I would be rejected. I would make sure the rejection got back to her. I would let her hear the rumors that Augustus King was broke, that he was selling his tools, that he was eating cat food. I would feed the monster. And in 3 weeks, when she walked into that Lawyer Represents office thinking she was the queen of the world, she would find out that the throne she was fighting for was actually an electric chair, and I would be the one flipping the switch. The view from my apartment window was like looking at a stage play of my own life, but with someone else reading the lines. Through the high-powered lenses of my binoculars, I watched Tiffany pacing the length of the master bedroom she had claimed. The morning sun caught the diamond rings on her fingers, turning her hands into flashes of hard, cold light. She was holding a thick envelope, the official notification from the executor of the estate, telling her that she was the sole beneficiary of Dante King's primary will. She was reading it for the 10th time, shaking the paper as if she could shake the money directly out of it and onto the floor. I put the binoculars down and took a sip of lukewarm coffee. The notification was the first step in the sequence. Thurgood had timed it perfectly. The letter confirmed that she was now worth $500 million on paper. But paper cannot buy a Lamborghini. Paper cannot pay for a yacht, and paper certainly cannot pay off the gambling debts I suspected Kyle had accumulated. The legal system is slow. Probate takes months, sometimes years, before she could touch a single cent of Dante's money. The courts had to validate the will, settle the taxes, and clear the debts. Tiffany was currently the poorest rich woman in America, asset rich, but cash flow dead. My phone buzzed on the dusty table. It was Thurgood. "Is she dancing yet?" he asked, his voice dry and devoid of humor. "She is screaming," I said, picking up the binoculars again. "She just threw a vase at the wall. She realizes she cannot access the accounts," good Thurgood said. "Now we open the valve. We need to make her thirsty. Augustus, we need to make her feel like she is missing out on the opportunity of a lifetime. I just sent the email to her lawyer, the one we drafted, the one marked confidential regarding the government contract. It was a beautiful lie, simple and elegant. We had planted a rumor, a fabricated internal memo suggesting that KingTech was about to sign a massive defense contract with the Pentagon. The memo suggested that once the news went public, the stock price would double overnight, turning 500 million into a billion, but the buy-in window was closing in 48 hours. I hung up and watched. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for the greed to override the logic. An engineer knows that every material has a breaking point. You just have to apply the right amount of pressure in the right place. Tiffany represents breaking point was her vanity. She didn't just want to be rich. She wanted to be a tycoon. She wanted to prove that she was smarter than Dante, smarter than me. Across the street, I saw her stop pacing. She was looking at her phone, reading the forwarded email from her lawyer. I saw her eyes widen. I saw her grab Kyle Represent's arm, digging her nails into his bicep. She showed him the screen. They looked at each other with the hungry, desperate look of wolves staring at a wounded deer. They started high-fiving, jumping up and down on the bed where my son had died of a broken heart. She took the bait. An hour later, a black town car pulled up to the gate. Tiffany and Kyle emerged dressed in their funeral best but looking like they were going to a casino. They were heading to the private bank downtown, the only place that would even consider lending money to someone with Tiffany Represent's credit score, based on an inheritance that was not yet settled. I grabbed my jacket and my cane. I didn't need to be in the room to know what was happening, but I wanted to be close enough to feel the vibration. When the door slammed shut on her future, I took a taxi to the financial district, asking the driver to park across from the glass tower of the First Merchant Bank I sat in, the back seat watching through the tinted window. Inside the bank, I knew exactly how the scene was playing out because Thurgood had briefed the senior loan officer, Mr. Sterling. Sterling was an old friend, a man who despised people like Tiffany. He couldn't lie to her legally, but he could certainly let her lie to herself. Tiffany would be sitting there crossing her legs, demanding $5 million in immediate liquidity. She would be waving the will around, shouting about her net worth. She would tell Sterling that she needed the money to exercise stock options to buy into the company before the big announcement. She would call it a bridge loan. A bridge to nowhere. I imagined her voice shrill and demanding. "Do you know who I am? I am Mrs. Dante King. I own half this city. If you don't give me the loan, I will take my $500 million to your competitor the moment the probate clears." It was the ultimate bluff, and Sterling played his part perfectly. He would hesitate. He would look at her credit report, which was likely a disaster. He would look at the will, and then he would make the offer. The offer that looked like a lifeline, but was actually a noose. "Ms. King, we can authorize a personal loan of $5 million. But since the estate is not yet settled, we will need a personal guarantee. You will have to pledge the entire inheritance as collateral. If you default on this loan, we have the right to seize the assets of the estate to cover the debt plus interest and penalties." It was a standard clause, but in this case, it was the kill switch. If Tiffany turned out not to be the heir, if the second will was activated, she would still be personally liable for the $5 million. She would be borrowing money she could never pay back against an asset she would never own. I saw Tiffany walk out of the bank 40 minutes later. She wasn't just walking, she was strutting. She held a cashier's check in her hand, waving it slightly in the breeze. Kyle was grinning like a shark, trailing behind her, carrying her purse. They stopped on the sidewalk and Tiffany held the check up to the sun, inspecting it. Her face was flushed with the intoxication of easy money. She had done it. She had signed her life away for a gamble. She had leveraged a ghost. I watched them get back into the town car. The driver pulled away, heading straight for the brokerage firm. She was going to dump every cent of that $5 million into KingTech stock, buying at the top of the market, banking on a rumor that I had invented. She was buying shares in a company that was about to undergo a massive leadership crisis. The moment the truth about the ownership came out, the stock would plummet. She was buying tickets on the Titanic after it had already hit the iceberg. I returned to my apartment, feeling a heavy, weary satisfaction. The first bolt of the trap had been fired, but Tiffany wasn't done yet. Greed is an appetite that is never satisfied. Having the money wasn't enough. She needed an audience. She needed to show the world that she had won. That evening, the lights in the King estate blazed like a supernova. Delivery trucks began arriving in a steady stream. I saw florists carrying massive arrangements of white orchids. I saw caterers unloading crates of champagne and caviar. I saw a team of event planners running around the garden, hanging lanterns in the trees. She was planning a party, a victory party. A celebration of my son represents death, disguised as a memorial. My phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. It was an image, a digital invitation. The King Legacy Gala, honoring the life of Dante King, hosted by his loving widow, Tiffany King. I stared at the screen. Loving widow. The words made bile rise in my throat. She was throwing a party with borrowed money to celebrate the fortune she thought she had stolen, and then another text came through. This one was from Tiffany directly. Augustus, since you are still lurking around town, I suppose you can come. You can park the cars. The valet service is short-staffed. It is the only way you will get a meal. Pay is $10 an hour. Don't be late. I looked at the message, and for a moment the engineer in me wanted to calculate the sheer density of her cruelty. It was impressive in a way, absolute and unyielding. She wanted to reduce me to a servant in my own home. She wanted me to open doors for the people who used to work for me. She wanted to break my spirit publicly, but she forgot that you cannot break what has already been forged in fire. I typed a single word in reply. Okay. I put the phone down and walked to the closet. I pulled out my old valet uniform from 50 years ago, the one I had kept as a reminder of where I started. It was a little tight across the shoulders, but it fit. I brushed the lint off the lapel. My hands were steady. She wanted a valet. I would give her a valet. I would park the cars. I would hold the umbrellas. I would open the doors. And while I was doing it, I would be watching, I would be listening, and I would be waiting. Because the higher she built this tower of lies, the more debris would fall when I pulled the pin. I looked out the window one last time at the mansion glowing in the night. It looked beautiful, vibrant, and alive. But I knew the truth. It was a house of cards. And the wind was picking up. The rain that night was not a storm. It was a cold, persistent drizzle that soaked through the thin polyester of the valet uniform Tiffany had sent over. It was a uniform meant for a teenager, a bright red vest with gold braiding that looked ridiculous on a 72-year-old man. But I wore it. I buttoned it all the way to my chin, covering the scar on my neck from the surgery I had 3 years ago, trying to keep the dampness from settling into my bones. I stood under the awning of the King estate, the house I had helped pay for the house where my son had taken his first steps, and I waited for the parasites to arrive. They came in a procession of chrome and leather luxury sedans and sports cars that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. These were the people Tiffany called friends, socialites, influencers, and hangers-on, who smelled money, like sharks smell blood. I opened the doors for them, bowing my head, letting the rain drip from the brim of my cap onto my nose. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the King estate," I said over and over again. My voice was gravelly low, a sound that disappeared under the noise of their laughter and the bass thumping from inside the mansion. Most of them looked right through me. To them, I was just a fixture, a piece of machinery that moved their cars to the lower lot, but a few of them recognized me. I saw Mr. Henderson, a board member of my son Represents Company, do a double take as he stepped out of his Bentley. "Augustus," he whispered, his eyes widening in shock. "Is that you? What are you doing here?" I didn't look him in the eye. I kept my gaze fixed on the emblem of his car. "I am just parking cars tonight, Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Enjoy the party." He hesitated, looking from me to the front door where Tiffany was greeting guests with a glass of champagne in her hand. He shook his head, muttering something about the world going mad, and walked inside. He didn't offer to help. He didn't turn around and leave in protest. He walked inside to drink the wine and eat the food just like the rest of them. It was a valuable data point. Loyalty has a price, and apparently the price was an open bar. The humiliation was a physical weight heavier than the wet wool of my coat. But I bore it because I knew that every insult, every dismissive glance was a brick in the wall I was building around Tiffany. She came out onto the porch after an hour, flanked by Kyle, who was wearing one of Dante Represents' tuxedos. The suit was tight across his broad shoulders, the sleeves a little too short, giving him the appearance of a child playing dress-up, in his father Represents clothes. Tiffany spotted me standing by a dripping oak tree, and her face lit up with a cruel delight. She walked over, shielding her hair with a clutch that cost $5,000. "Hey, Augustus," she called out, her voice loud enough to carry over the music. "Make sure you don't scratch the paint on the Lamborghinis. My friends are very particular and try to stand up straight. You look like a scarecrow." Kyle laughed, a braying sound that grated on my nerves. "Hey back, Tom," he shouted, raising his glass. "Maybe if you hustle, you will make enough tips to buy a new suitcase." Uncle Tom, again with the slur, again with the disrespect, telling me to dance for my supper. I looked at them, at the way they leaned into each other, drunk on power and liquor, and I forced my mouth into a tight, subservient smile. "Yes, Ma, I said. "I will be careful." She smirked, satisfied that she had reduced the patriarch of the King family to a servant. "Good. Now go move that Porsche. It is blocking the fire lane." I took the keys she threw at me, catching them in mid-air. I walked to the car, my bad leg dragging slightly on the wet pavement. I could feel her eyes on my back, could feel the heat of her triumph. She thought this was the end. She thought she was looking at a broken man, but she wasn't looking closely enough. If she had looked into my eyes, she would have seen the cold calculation of an engineer watching a bridge vibrate in the wind, waiting for the collapse. I parked the Porsche, and instead of returning to the valet stand immediately, I circled back through the side garden. It was dark there, the shadows deep and comforting. I moved through the wet hydrangeas, the flowers bobbing heavy with rain, until I was standing just below the stone balustrade of the terrace. The party had spilled outside despite the drizzle. The guests were gathered under the heated patio cover, smoking cigars and shouting over the music. I pulled my phone from my pocket. It was an old model, cracked screen and taped together, but the microphone worked perfectly. I pressed record and held it up toward the railing waiting Tiffany was holding. Court. She was standing in the center of a group of women who were fawning over her diamond necklace. "Oh, Tiffany, it is gorgeous," one of them squealed. "Dante must have really loved you to leave you all this." I held my breath. The rain ran down my collar, freezing against my skin, but I didn't move. This was the moment Thurgood had told me to wait for, the moment of hubris. "Tiffany represents," laugh rang out harsh and metallic. "Love," she scoffed, taking a long swallow of her drink. Please. Dante didn't know what love was. He was a bore, a workaholic. All he cared about were his stupid codes, and his daddy represents approval. The women giggled nervously, untying the knot of silence around Tiffany, represents tongue. "Honestly," she continued, her voice rising, slurring slightly, "getting rid of him was the best thing that ever happened to me. Living with him was like living with a nun. He was so tedious, always worrying about ethics, always worrying about the employees. Who cares about the employees? I care about the yacht. I watched the audio levels on my phone spike, capturing every word. But what about his father?" another voice asked. The old guy outside. "Isn't it a little mean to make him park cars?" Tiffany snorted, and I heard the clink of glass as she set her drink down on the stone railing directly above my head. "Mean," she said. "Listen to me. That old man is trash. He is garbage. He has been leeching off us for years, walking around here like he built the place, telling me how to run my house. He is lucky I didn't have him put down like a sick dog." She paused, and I could hear her lighting a cigarette, the flick of the lighter sounding like a gunshot. "Let me tell you something," she said, and her voice dropped to a conspiratorial hiss that carried perfectly in the damp air. "Dante wasn't a husband. He was just an ATM. He was a bank account with a pulse. And now that the pulse is gone, I finally get to keep the debit card. The old man thinks he can guilt me, thinks he can shame me with his sad eyes. Let him rot. He can park cars until he drops dead for all I care. I won't even pay for the funeral this time." I froze. The recording time ticked upward. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Had it. I had the confession. I had the gross moral turpitude Thurgood needed. She had called her husband an ATM. She had called his father trash. She had admitted to using him solely for money, and she had expressed a complete lack of remorse. The women around her laughed again, but it was a darker sound now, uneasy, complicit. They were parasites too, feeding off her energy, but even they sensed the rot beneath the surface. I stopped the recording and saved the file, naming it simply the ATM. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, pressing it against my chest like a shield. I stood there for a moment longer, listening to the rain fall on the leaves, listening to the music that couldn't drown out the ugliness of the souls on that terrace. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is hot. Anger is volatile. What I felt was cold. It was the absolute zero of space, the vacuum where no life can survive. They were dead to me. Not just Tiffany, but the memory of the woman my son thought he loved. She never existed. This creature above me was just a virus that had infected our lives, and I had just isolated the strain. I walked back to the valet stand, my step lighter despite the mud on my shoes. I finished my shift. Parking cars for the people who laughed at my son represents death. I took their dollar bills, I opened their doors, and I said goodnight. But as I walked away from the King estate that night, clutching the $10 bills Tiffany had thrown at me, I didn't feel like a servant. I felt like the executioner who had just sharpened his blade. The party was over. The hangover was coming, and it was going to be fatal. The week following the party was a blur of calculated destruction viewed through the lenses of my binoculars. I thought I had seen the bottom of Tiffany represents greed when she threw my clothes into the street or when she made me park cars for her friends. But I was wrong. Greed has no bottom. It is a black hole that consumes light and matter until there is nothing left but a void. And Tiffany was standing at the edge of that void, throwing my son represents life into it piece by piece. It started on a Tuesday morning with a fleet of black sedans arriving at the estate. These were not party guests. They were sharks, corporate liquidators and patent trolls, men who specialize in buying desperation. I watched from my window as Tiffany led them into. Dante represents home office. She was holding a stack of files that I recognized by the color of the binding. These were the blue folders, the proprietary files, the patents for the next generation of guidance systems Dante had spent 10 years developing. I pulled out my phone and tapped into the audio bug I had planted in the office. The quality was crisp. The liquidator, a man with a voice like sandpaper, was lowballing her. "Mrs. King," he said, "this technology is impressive, but it is unfinished. The R&D required to bring it to market is substantial. We can offer you $2 million for the entire portfolio, rights and royalties included. $2 million. For technology that was projected to be worth $1 billion in 5 years, Dante had called it his magnum opus. It was the legacy that would secure the company for generations, and this woman, this tourist in our lives, was about to sell it for the price of a boat. "Just give me the check," Tiffany said, her voice bored, impatient. "I don't care about the R&D. I need the liquidity. My yacht broker is holding the vessel until Friday, and I am not losing my deposit over some boring science stuff. Do we have a deal?" I gripped the windowsill so hard my knuckles turned white. She was selling the future to pay for a toy. She was selling the engine to buy paint for the hull. I wanted to run across the street and shake her. I wanted to scream that she was burning the library to heat the stove, but I forced myself to stay put. Thurgood had said we needed her to cross the line of no return. This was it. She was dismantling the company, represents assets for personal gain. It was criminal. It was irreversible, and it was the final nail in her coffin. But the business liquidation was just business. The personal destruction that followed on Wednesday was the thing that broke my heart into pieces small enough to fit in a dustpan. A large yellow dumpster arrived at noon, dropping onto the driveway with a ground-shaking thud. It was followed by a crew of rough-looking men in coveralls. They weren't movers, they were junk haulers. The slogan on their truck read, "We make it disappear." I watched as they marched into the east wing of the house, the wing where Dante had built his private laboratory. It was a sanctuary, a place where he and I had spent thousands of hours tinkering, building, and dreaming. It was where I taught him how to solder a circuit board. It was where he showed me his first line of code. Tiffany came out onto the front steps holding a glass of iced tea, pointing at the lab windows. "Clear it all out," she shouted. "I want that room empty by sunset. Kyle wants to turn it into a virtual golf simulator." The men went to work like termites. They didn't carry things out, they threw them out. I saw monitors smash into the dumpster. I saw expensive oscilloscopes, specialized testing equipment that Dante had calibrated by hand, tossed onto the pile like garbage. The sound of breaking glass and crunching metal drifted across the street, a symphony of violence against knowledge. And then I saw it. One of the workers walked out carrying a large cardboard box. He tripped on the stairs and the box fell open, spilling its contents onto the driveway. It wasn't electronics, it wasn't paperwork, it was balsa wood. They were the model airplanes. My breath caught in my throat, tears pricking my eyes instantly. There was the P-51 Mustang we had built when Dante was 8 years old. We had spent 3 weeks sanding the wings, getting the curvature just right. There was the Wright Flyer, the one that had won him the blue ribbon at the middle school science fair. There was the large remote-controlled glider we used to fly in. The Park on Sundays, the one he called the Eagle because he said it looked like it was watching over us. These weren't just toys. They were the physical manifestation of a father represents love for his son. They were the hours we spent talking about life, about honor, about what it means to be a man while the glue dried on our fingers. They were the happiest moments of my life. Kyle walked out of the house wearing Dante represents silk robe again, looking at the mess on the driveway. He walked over to the pile of fragile wood and picked up the P-51 Mustang. He held it up, examining it, not with curiosity, but with disdain. "Look at this junk," he laughed, shouting to Tiffany. "Did your husband play with dolls too? This looks like firewood to me." Tiffany laughed, a sound that pierced my soul, harsh and unfeeling. "Just throw it in the dumpster, Kyle. It is clutter. We need space for the simulator." Kyle nodded. He didn't place the plane in the dumpster. He dropped it on the pavement and then, looking directly at where he thought I might be watching, he lifted his foot and stomped on it. The crunch of the balsa wood was audible, even from across the street. I felt it in my own chest, as if he had stomped on my ribcage. He ground his heel into the wreckage, snapping the delicate wings, crushing the fuselage, reducing my memory of my 8-year-old son to splinters and dust. Then he picked up the rest, kicking the glider into the dumpster, tossing the science fair ribbon into the mud. He was erasing us. He was erasing the history of the King family, wiping away the evidence that we had ever loved each other, that we had ever built something beautiful. I lowered the binoculars. My hands were trembling violently. The rage I felt wasn't hot anymore. It was cold, glacial, and terrifyingly absolute. I had played the game. I had been the old horse. I had let them humiliate me. But this was a desecration. This was a war crime against the heart. I turned away from the window, unable to watch them destroy another piece of my soul. I walked to the small kitchenette in my dusty apartment and poured a glass of water, drinking it in one long gulp, trying to cool the fire in my throat. Then I pulled out my phone. I didn't call Tiffany. I didn't call the police. I dialed the number that had been saved in my favorites for 40 years. Thurgood answered on the first ring, as if he had been waiting for the signal. "It is time," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of inflection. It sounded like the voice of a machine. "Did she sell the patents?" Thurgood asked. "She sold them," I replied. $2 million for the guidance system. And Thurgood, she destroyed the lab. She destroyed the models, the ones Dante and I built. She crushed them. There was a silence on the other end of the line, a heavy, respectful silence. Thurgood knew what those models meant. He was the one who had bought me the kit for the Mustang when Dante was born. "I am sorry, Augustus," he said softly. "I am truly sorry." "Don't be sorry," I said, gripping the phone so tight that plastic creaked. "Be a lawyer. Activate Article 17. "Are you sure?" Thurgood asked. "Once we pull this trigger, there is no going back. The assets freeze, the accounts lock, the police are notified. It is the nuclear option." I walked back to the window, looking at the yellow dumpster. Filling up with my son represents dreams. I looked at Tiffany and Kyle laughing on the porch, high-fiving over the destruction of a legacy they could never understand. "I don't want to go back," I said. "I want to burn it down. Burn it all down so they have nowhere to hide. Finish it, Thurgood. End this game." "Understood," Thurgood said, his voice shifting into professional steel. "I am filing the motion now. The reading of the will is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9. Make sure you are there, and Augustus, wear your best suit." I hung up the phone and looked at the suit hanging on the back of the door. It was black, sharp, and expensive. It was the suit of a CEO, not a valet. It was the suit of a father who was about to avenge his son. I looked out the window one last time. Tiffany was holding a bottle of champagne, spraying it over the dumpster, christening her pile of garbage. She thought she was clearing space for a golf simulator. She didn't know she was clearing space for her own prison cell. "Enjoy the champagne," Tiffany, I whispered to the glass, enjoy the victory lap, because tomorrow you run into the wall, and I will be the one holding the bricks. The audio feed from the master bedroom of the King estate had become my nightly radio show, a soap opera of greed spiraling into madness. For the first few days after the funeral, it was just the sound of champagne corks popping and bed springs creaking, the soundtrack of two people celebrating a lottery win. But as the week dragged on and the bank continued to delay the release of the liquid assets, the tone changed. The laughter stopped. The champagne was replaced by the clinking of hard liquor bottles, and tonight the silence was broken by the sound of violence. I sat in my dark apartment wearing my headphones, listening to the monster reveal his true face. Kyle was pacing the floor. I could hear his heavy footsteps moving back and forth like a caged tiger. Tiffany was crying soft, jagged sobs that sounded pathetic coming from the woman who had evicted me. "Where is the cash?" "Tiffany," Kyle shouted, his voice distorting the microphone. "I don't want to hear about probate. I don't want to hear about the judge. I need $1 million by noon tomorrow. Or do you want my bookie to come here and break my legs on your Italian marble floor?" "Kyle, please." Tiffany begged, her voice trembling. "I am trying. The bank says the loan is pending. They are just doing due diligence. It takes time. The estate is huge." "I don't have time," Kyle roared. There was a loud crash, the sound of a lamp shattering against the wall. "You told me you were rich. You told me the old man was out of the picture. You told me we were golden. But all I see is a big house and empty pockets. You are useless, Tiffany. You, Tiffany, are just a broke widow playing dress-up." I heard the sound of a slap. It was the same sound that had echoed in the funeral home when she hit my wrist. But this time she was the one on the receiving end. She screamed a high-pitched sound of terror and pain. "Don't you hit me," she shrieked. "I am the one with the money. I am the one in charge. You have nothing." Kyle spat. "You are a fraud. Fix this, Tiffany. Go find a way to unlock that money, or I will unlock your jaw. Do you understand me?" The recording went silent, save for her weeping. I took off the headphones and rubbed my eyes. The predator had become the prey. Kyle wasn't a lover, he was a parasite attached to a host that was running dry, and like all parasites, when the food runs out, he starts to eat the host alive. I knew what she would do next. She couldn't fight Kyle. She was too weak, too dependent on his validation, so she would punch down. She would come for the one person she thought she could still control. Me. Sure enough, an hour later, I saw the headlights of her car sweep across my ceiling. She had parked illegally in front of my rundown apartment building, ignoring the fire hydrant. She stormed up the stairs, her heels hammering against the concrete like gunshots. I unlocked the door before she could pound on it. I didn't want her waking the neighbors. I wanted this confrontation to be private. She burst into the room, bringing the smell of stale alcohol and expensive perfume with her. She looked wrecked. Her hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was pulled back in a messy bun. Her left cheek was red, slightly swollen, a souvenir from her boyfriend's affection. She looked around my dusty apartment at the peeling wallpaper and the single mattress on the floor, and she sneered, trying to summon her old arrogance. "Look at you," she said, breathless and frantic, "living like a rat. It suits you, Augustus." I leaned on my cane, keeping my face impassive. "What do you want, Tiffany?" "It is late. I want you to sign this," she said, pulling a crumpled document from her purse. She slapped it onto the rickety table between us. "It is a quitclaim deed and a waiver of contest. The bank says the only reason they are holding up the funds is because there might be a potential challenge from the next of kin. They need to know you are not going to fight the will." I looked at the paper. It was legal gibberish, a document she had probably downloaded from the internet and filled out herself. It stated that I, Augustus King, irrevocably waived all rights to Dante. King is estate, past, present, and future. It was a useless piece of paper, because I hadn't challenged the will yet, but in her desperate mind, this was the magic key that would unlock the vault. I haven't challenged anything. "Tiffany," I said, slowly, pretending to be confused. "I left the house. I gave you the keys. Why do I need to sign this?" "Because I said so," she screamed, slamming her hand on the table, making the dust jump. "Because I need that money now. Kyle needs... We need to pay off the debts Dante left us. And as long as you are lurking around, the bank is nervous. So sign it. Sign it and disappear." I looked at her desperate face, And I saw the fear behind the rage. She was terrified of Kyle. She was terrified of being poor. She was terrified of the lie she had built collapsing on top of her. But instead of asking for help, instead of admitting she was in trouble, she decided to threaten me. "I don't know," I said, shaking my head, feigning hesitation. Thurgood said, "I shouldn't sign anything without him reading it first. Maybe I should wait." That was the trigger. The hesitation. I pushed the button and the bomb exploded. "You will not wait," Tiffany hissed, leaning across the table, her face inches from mine. Her eyes were wide, manic, completely devoid of humanity. "If you don't sign this paper right now, Augustus, I swear to God I will make you regret it." I looked at her calmly. "What can you do, Tiffany? You already took my house. You took my son, represents money. You took my dignity. What is left?" She smiled. Then, a smile so cruel, so grotesque that it made the hair on my arms stand up. "I have his body," she whispered. The room went cold. The air seemed to freeze in my lungs. "What did you say?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "I have legal control over his remains," she said, straightening up, looking down at me with triumph. "Dante is buried in the King family plot. Yes, but as his widow, I have the right to exhume him. I have the right to move him. And if you don't pick up that pen and sign this paper, I will have him dug up tomorrow morning." She paused, letting the horror of her threat sink in. "I won't just move him, Augustus," she continued, her voice dropping to a flat, deadly monotone. "I will have him cremated. And I won't put him in an urn. I won't scatter him in the ocean. I will take his ashes into the master bathroom and I will flush them down the toilet. I will flush your precious son down the drain like the waste he was. And you will never have a grave to visit. You will never have a place to cry. He will be gone, flushed away into the city. Sewers." I stared at her, unable to breathe. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm of shock and rage. This was it. This was the gross moral turpitude Thurgood had talked about. This was the line. She hadn't just crossed it, she had obliterated it. To threaten the desecration of a grave, to threaten to flush. A man remains like sewage, was a level of evil that I hadn't even calculated. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white. I wanted to reach across and crush her throat. I wanted to silence that mouth forever. But I saw the ghost of Dante standing in the corner of the room looking at me, shaking his head. "Wait, Dad," he seemed to say. "Wait for the trap." I forced my body to relax. I forced my eyes to drop to the floor in submission. I let my shoulders slump, turning myself back into the defeated old man she wanted to see. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Don't do that, Tiffany. Please, not Dante. Not my Dante." "Boy, then sign the paper," she commanded, thrusting the pen into my hand. "Sign it, and I let him rot in peace. Refuse, and he goes down the drain." I took the pen. My hand shook genuinely this time. The sheer weight of her malice was heavy, pressing down on me. I looked at the paper, the waiver that meant nothing and everything. I pressed the tip to the page. "Okay," I said, tears of rage filling my eyes. "Okay, you win. I will sign. Just promise me you won't touch him." "I promise," she lied carelessly, checking her nails. "Sign it." I scrawled my signature, Augustus King. The ink looked black, like blood. I pushed the paper toward her. She snatched it up, checking the signature, blowing on the ink to dry it. "There," she said, stuffing it back into her purse. "Was that so hard? Now I can go to the bank tomorrow and get my money. And you can go back to being nothing." She turned and walked to the door, her heels clicking on the floorboards. She paused at the threshold, looking back at me one last time. "You know, Augustus," she said, a smirk playing on her lips. "I might cremate him anyway one day, just to save on the maintenance fees for the plot. Goodbye, old man. Try not to die in here. The smell would bother the neighbors." She slammed the door, leaving me in the silence of my dusty apartment. I sat there for a long time, staring at the wood grain of the table. The threat hung in the air, a toxic cloud. Flush him down the drain. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The recording app was still running. I stopped it and saved the file, naming it The Flush. I looked at the file. It was the final nail. It was the evidence that would strip her of everything. But as I sat there, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt cold. I felt the chill of a man who has looked into the abyss and seen it smiling back. I stood up and walked to the window, watching her car speed away, watching her rush back to Kyle, back to the abuse, back to the illusion of wealth she had just sold her soul to protect. "You think you have a signature, Tiffany?" I whispered to the empty street. "You think you have a key, but you just signed your own death warrant? You threatened the dead, but tomorrow the dead are going to answer." I turned away from the window and picked up the picture of Dante I kept on the nightstand. I wiped a speck of dust from the glass. "Rest easy, son," I said. My voice was hard now, cold as the steel of a blade. "She won't touch you. She won't ever touch you again. Because by this time tomorrow, she won't even own the shoes on her feet." I dialed Thurgood's number. He answered on the first ring. "She did it," I said. The words tasted like ash. She threatened to dig him up. Thurgood, she threatened to flush his ashes. There was a silence on the line, a heavy, stunned silence. Then Thurgood spoke, and his voice was the sound of a judge passing sentence. "My God," "My God," whispered. "That is it, Augustus. That is the end. We have everything. Bring the recording to my office in the morning." The reading is at noon. I hung up and sat on the edge of the mattress. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there in the dark, polishing my shoes, preparing my suit, sharpening my mind. I was done being the victim. I was done being the old horse. Tomorrow the lion would wake up, and the feast would begin. The law offices of Mosley and Associates were located on the 42nd floor of the Guardian Building, a structure of granite and steel that looked down upon the city like a judge on a high bench. The conference room was a sanctuary of silence, smelling of lemon polish, old leather, and the heavy weight of the law. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, my hands folded over the head of my cane. I was wearing my best suit, a charcoal three-piece that I hadn't worn since I received my Lifetime Achievement Award from the Engineering Guild 10 years ago. It was a little loose around. The waist now stress has a way of carving meat from your bones, but my shoulders filled the jacket just fine. I sat straight, immobile, a statue of patience waiting for the storm to break. Thurgood sat at the head of the table, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. In front of him sat a single manila envelope sealed with red wax. To his right sat Mr. Sterling, the loan officer from the bank who had lent Tiffany the $5 million. Sterling looked nervous, tapping his pen on his leather folio. He was there to collect. He had brought the loan documents and a transfer order ready to seize the funds the moment the probate was finalized. He was the vulture waiting for the carcass, but he didn't know the carcass was poisoned. We waited. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking the seconds past 9 o'clock. Thurgood checked his watch and looked at me, raising a single white eyebrow. "She is late," he murmured. "She is making an entrance," I replied, my voice low. "She wants us to know that, thus. Our time is less valuable than hers." At 9:20, the double doors swung open with a force that banged them against the stops. Tiffany walked in, and she did not look like a grieving widow. She looked like a coronation. She was wearing a white suit, sharp and tailored, cut low to show off the diamond necklace that used to belong to my wife. She wasn't wearing black. She was done with mourning. Today was payday. Kyle trailed behind her like a loyal dog on a diamond leash. He was wearing a suit that was too shiny, the fabric shimmering under the fluorescent lights. He had a pair of sunglasses perched on his head, and he was chewing gum, dragging the scent of mint and arrogance into the solemn room. "Sorry we are late," Tiffany said, not sounding sorry at all. She threw her purse onto the table, the heavy buckle scratching the polished wood. The traffic was a nightmare, and honestly I had to fire the driver this morning. He was driving too slow. "I need speed today, gentlemen. I have a yacht broker waiting for a wire transfer at noon." She looked around the room, her eyes sliding over Thurgood, sliding over Mr. Sterling, and finally landing on me. She paused, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "What is he doing here?" she asked, pointing a manicured finger at me. "I thought we settled this. I have the waiver." He signed it. "It is in the file. He has no claim. Why do I have to look at his depressing face on the happiest day of my life?" Thurgood adjusted his glasses, his voice cool and measured. "Mr. King is present because he is a named party in the estate proceedings. Regardless of the waiver, he has a right to hear. The final disposition of his son represents assets. Sit down, Mrs. King." "We have a lot to cover." Tiffany rolled her eyes, pulling out a chair and flopping into it. Kyle sat next to her, putting his feet up on the rung of the chair beside him, looking bored. "Let's make this quick, old man," Kyle said, looking at Thurgood. "I have a tea time at 2. And Tiff here needs to go shopping. We are remodeling the whole East Wing, getting rid of that dusty old library, turning it into a lounge." I tightened my grip on my cane. The library was where Dante had taught himself to read. The library was where we kept the family Bible. But I said nothing. I watched them. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, looking at Tiffany, Mrs. King, before we proceed. "I just need to verify that the transfer authorization is signed. As we discussed, the $5 million loan is due in full immediately upon the execution of the will, plus the accrued interest if there are any delays in the disbursement." Tiffany waved her hand, dismissing him like a fly. "Relax, Sterling. You are so uptight. The money is sitting in the trust account waiting for me to say the magic word. I will pay you your $5 million, and I will give you a tip for being so patient. You can have the money by lunch. Now let us get to the good part." She turned to Thurgood, drumming her fingers on the table. "Read it. Read the part where I get everything. Read the part where I become the queen of this city." Thurgood picked up the envelope. He didn't break the seal yet. He held it in his hands, looking at it with a strange expression, almost like sadness. "Before I open this," Thurgood said, looking directly at Tiffany, "I need to ask you one final question. Mrs. King, is there anything you wish to disclose to the court regarding your relationship with the deceased or your conduct since his passing? This is your last opportunity to amend the record." Tiffany laughed, a sharp barking sound. "Disclose? What is there to disclose? I was the perfect wife. I stood by him while he worked himself to death. I planned the funeral. I am wearing his jewelry. What more do you want? A certificate of sainthood. Just open the damn envelope. Thurgood, I am tired of the drama." "And you, Kyle?" Thurgood asked, shifting his gaze to the boyfriend. "Do you have anything to say regarding your presence in the marital home?" Kyle stopped chewing his gum. He smirked, looking at me, then back at Thurgood. "Hey, I am just the grief counselor, man. I am helping the widow through a hard time. Dante would have wanted her to be happy, right? We are just honoring his memory." I saw Thurgood Represent's jaw tighten. He looked at me for a split second, a microscopic nod. It was done. They had doubled down. They had denied everything. They had walked right into the kill zone. Thurgood broke the wax seal. The sound was a loud crack in the silent room. He pulled out a document. It was thick, bound in blue paper. "This is the last will and testament of Dante Marcus King." Thurgood began, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of the law. "I, being of sound mind and body, hereby declare this to be my final will, revoking all prior wills and codicils." Tiffany leaned forward, her eyes wide and hungry, licking her lips like a predator spotting a wounded gazelle. "This is it," she whispered to Kyle, almost vibrating with greed. "Here comes the jackpot," Thurgood continued. "Article 1. I hereby acknowledge my wife, Tiffany King, however." He paused. Tiffany frowned. However, what? There shouldn't be a however. It should say, "I leave everything to my beloved wife." Keep reading. Thurgood looked up over his reading glasses. "However, this bequest is contingent upon the fulfillment of the moral clause outlined in the attached codicil, specifically that my wife has treated my father, Augustus King, with dignity and respect and has maintained the sanctity of our marital home for a period of 30 days following my death." Tiffany, frozen. The color began to drain from her face, escaping down her neck, leaving her pale and patchy. "Moral clause," she stammered. "What moral clause? That is archaic. You can't put that in a will. It is standard in high-value estates," Thurgood said calmly. "But let us continue. Article 2. The primary bequest." Tiffany relaxed slightly. Okay, whatever. I treated the old man fine. I let him sleep in the basement, didn't I? Just read the numbers." Thurgood turned the page. "In the event that the moral clause is violated," he stopped again. He reached under the table and pulled out a small digital recorder. My recorder, the one I had given him that morning, the one with the file named The Flush. "What is that?" Tiffany asked, her voice rising in pitch, a note of hysteria creeping in. "What are you doing?" Thurgood pressed play. The sound of Tiffany Represent's voice filled the room, distorted but unmistakable, loud and cruel. "If you don't sign this paper right now, Augustus, I swear to God I will make you regret it. I will have him cremated, and I won't put him in an urn. I will flush him down the toilet." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of the room. Mr. Sterling gasped, his hand flying to his mouth, looking at Tiffany as if she had turned into a demon. Kyle took his feet off the chair, sitting up straight, his eyes darting around, looking for an exit. Tiffany sat frozen, her mouth open, the recording echoing in her mind. She looked at me, and for the first time she saw it. She didn't see a victim. She saw the trap. She saw the engineer who had spent 40 years building things that didn't break. That is fake," she screamed, standing up, knocking her chair over. "It is AI. It is a deep fake. He made it up. He is trying to frame me." Thurgood stopped the recording. He looked at her with a disgust so profound it felt like a physical blow. "It has been authenticated, Mrs. King, and combined with the sworn affidavits regarding your eviction of Mr. King, the cancellation of his health insurance, and the cohabitation with Mr. Kyle Evans less than 24 hours after the funeral, the moral clause is considered breached in its entirety." "Breached," Tiffany whispered, swaying slightly. "No, that is not possible. You can't take it away. I signed the loan. Sterling, tell him I signed the loan. I have the money." Mr. Sterling stood up, closing his folio with a snap. "Mrs. King, if the collateral for the loan is void, the loan is in default immediately. I am afraid I have to freeze your personal accounts to cover the principal. You don't have the money. You have a debt." Tiffany looked wildly from Sterling to Thurgood. Then she turned on me, her face twisting into a mask of pure hate. "You!" she shrieked, lunging across the table, her hands clawing at the air. "You set me up, you old snake! You tricked me into signing that waiver." "The waiver?" Thurgood interrupted, his voice booming, now filling the room. "The waiver you forced him to sign under duress, under the threat of desecrating a corpse. That waiver is not only void, it is evidence of extortion, but none of that matters, Mrs. King, because even if you had been a saint, even if you had treated Augustus like a king, you still wouldn't get the money." Tiffany stopped panting, her hands gripping the edge of the table. What are you talking about?" "Dante left it to me. It is in the will." Thurgood picked up a single sheet of paper from the bottom of the stack. He held it up. "It was yellowed with age, dated 20 years ago. He couldn't leave it to you, Mrs. King," Thurgood said softly, "because he never owned it." The room seemed to tilt. Tiffany looked at the paper, then at Dante. Represent's name on the will, then at me. She was trying to process the impossible. She was trying to understand how the ground she was standing on had suddenly vanished. "He was the CEO," she whispered. "He founded King Tech. It was his company." Thurgood shook his head, looking at me with pride. "He was the CEO, yes, but he was an employee. He drew a salary. He had a title, but the intellectual property, the patents, the original code, the entire foundation of King Tech belongs to the holding trust." "And who owns the trust?" Tiffany asked, her voice barely a squeak. I stood up. Then I used the table for leverage, pushing myself up until I was standing tall, towering. Over her, I looked her in the eye and I let the silence stretch. I let her feel the weight of every insult, every slur, every moment of disrespect. "I do," I said. The words hit her like a physical blow. She staggered back, clutching her chest. "The founder represents agreement." Thurgood read from the yellow paper. Explicitly states that Augustus King retains 100% ownership of all assets, technology, and equity. Dante King was granted a lifetime right of use, but upon his death, all assets revert to the original owner. I walked around the table slowly, the tap of my cane sounding like a gavel. I stopped in front of Tiffany. She was trembling, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. "You called him an ATM. Tiffany," I said, my voice low and hard. "You were right. He was just the interface. But I am the bank, and the bank is closed." Tiffany looked at me, her eyes wide with horror. Then she looked at Kyle, seeking support, seeking a lifeline. But Kyle was already standing up. He was looking at his phone, backing away toward the door. Tiffany pleaded, "Help me. Tell them it is a lie." Kyle looked at her. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the angry banker standing in the corner. "Babe," he said, his voice cold and distant. "You told me you had 500 million. You didn't tell me you were 5 million in the hole. I don't date broke chicks. He turned and walked out the door, leaving her alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the wreckage of her own greed. Tiffany sank to the floor, her white suit pooling around her like a surrender flag. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. Genuine tears of terror this time. Augustus. Please, she sobbed. I didn't know I am family. I looked down at her, at the woman who had threatened to flush my son down a drain. No, Tiffany, I said. You are just a variable, and I just solved the equation. The atmosphere in the conference room shifted the moment. Thurgood broke the wax seal on the blue document. It was a sound like a bone snapping dry, and final Thurgood adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the paper, his face impassive, a mask of legal neutrality that gave nothing away. Tiffany was leaning forward in her chair, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles white with anticipation. Kyle was chewing his gum louder, smacking his lips with a disrespect that echoed in the silent room. The banker, Mr. Sterling, was sweating, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief, afraid that his $5 million gamble was about to evaporate. I sat still, my hands resting on the head of my cane, watching them. I knew what was in that document. I knew because I had seen the video logs of my son weeping in his office, terrified of the woman who now sat across from me expecting a coronation. Thurgood cleared his throat, a deep rumble that silenced the room, and began to read. I, Dante Marcus King, being of sound mind and acting under no duress, do hereby bequeath my entire estate, real and personal, to my lawful wife Tiffany King. This includes, but is not limited to, the property known as the King Estate, the liquid assets held in the First Merchant Bank Trust, and the controlling interest in King Tech Corporation. Thurgood paused, letting the words hang in the air. Tiffany let out a scream. It wasn't a scream of relief. It was a scream of conquest. She jumped out of her chair legs screeching against the floor, and threw her arms in the air. Yes, she shouted, her voice shrill and piercing. Yes, I knew it. I told you. He left it all to me, every single cent. She grabbed Kyle, pulling him out of his chair and planting a wet, sloppy kiss on his mouth, right there in the solemnity of a law office, ignoring the fact that she had just heard her dead husband represent's last words. We are rich, baby, she squealed. We are set for life. The yacht, the house, the cars. It is all ours. Kyle grinned, wrapping his arms around her waist, lifting her slightly off the ground. That is what I am talking about. He laughed, looking at Mr. Sterling, giving him a thumbs up. Told you the money was good, Sterling. You can unfreeze those accounts now. We are going shopping. Tiffany pulled away from Kyle and turned her gaze to me. Her eyes were bright with malice, burning with the triumph of the wicked. She walked around the table, her heels clicking sharply on the floor, until she was standing right in front of me, invading my space, smelling of expensive perfume and rot. Well, old man, she sneered, leaning down so her face was level with mine. Did you hear that? Did you hear the lawyer? He left it to me. To his lawful wife, not to his daddy, not to his charity case. To me. She poked my shoulder with a manicured finger, hard, painful. See, Augustus, she continued, her voice dripping with venom. You thought you were so smart, sneaking around, spying on me, calling the insurance company. But in the end, you are just what I said you were, a loser. You have empty pockets. Augustus, you have nothing. The house is mine, the money is mine. Even the shirt on your back was paid for by my husband. So, technically that is mine too. She straightened up, looking down her nose at me, brushing an invisible speck of dust from her white suit. I will give you 24 hours to get your junk out of that apartment across the street, she said. I don't want you looking at my house. I don't want you breathing my air. Go back to wherever you came from, Augustus. Go rot in a state home. Because the King family is done with you. Kyle laughed from across the room, clapping his hands slowly, mocking me. Yeah. Back, Tom. Time to hit the road. Maybe you can get a job parking cars permanently. You were pretty good at it. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I looked at Tiffany, at the sheer, unadulterated ugliness of her soul, and I felt a strange sense of calm. It was the calm of a man watching a child play with a grenade, knowing the pin has already been pulled. Are you finished, Tiffany? I asked quietly. She laughed, tossing her hair back. Oh, I am just getting started. But yes, I am finished with you. Get out of my sight. She turned, back to Thurgood, waving her hand dismissively. Okay, lawyer, we are done here. Give me the check, give me the keys, and let us wrap this up. I have a celebration to get to. Thurgood didn't move. He didn't hand her the document. He didn't reach for a checkbook. He just sat there looking at her over the rim of his glasses with a look of profound pity. "Sit down, Mrs. King," Thurgood said, his voice low and commanding. Tiffany froze halfway to her chair. "Excuse me," she snapped. "I am the sole beneficiary. I don't take orders from you. You work for me now." "No," Thurgood said simply. "I do not, and I strongly suggest you sit down because I haven't finished reading the file." Tiffany huffed, rolling her eyes, and flopped back into her chair, crossing her arms petulantly. "Fine. Read the fine print." "Whatever. Just get to the part where I get the money." Thurgood closed the blue folder. The sound was soft, a whisper compared to the crack of the seal. He placed his hands on the table, intertwining his fingers. "The document read is indeed the last will and testament written by Dante King," Thurgood said. "It is dated 3 months ago, and in it he does indeed attempt to leave his entire estate to you." "Attempt," Tiffany interrupted. "What do you mean, attempt? He did it. You just read it. He left me everything." Thurgood ignored her, continuing as if she hadn't spoken. "However, there is a fundamental principle in property law, Mrs. King, a principle that dates back centuries. It is a concept called title of ownership. Simply put, a man cannot bequeath what he does not own." The room went silent again, but this time it was a confused, heavy silence. Mr. Sterling stopped wiping his forehead and leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Kyle stopped chewing his gum. Tiffany frowned, looking from Thurgood to me and back again. "What are you talking about?" she asked, a nervous tremor entering her voice. "Dante owned everything. He was the CEO. He bought the house. He built the company. It was his name on the building." Thurgood shook his head slowly. "Regretfully, Dante King was the chief executive officer." "Yes," Thurgood explained. "He had a very generous salary. He had a corporate expense account, and he had the right to reside in the King estate, but he did not hold the title to the property, nor did he hold the controlling shares of King Tech Corporation." Tiffany let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You are lying," she spat. "That is impossible." "He was the founder. Everyone knows he was the founder. He was on the cover of Forbes. He was the face of the company. He was the face." Thurgood agreed. He was the public face. The handsome young man who could sell the vision. But the assets, the bricks and mortar, the patents, the intellectual property, and the equity, those were never his. Tiffany stood up again, her hands shaking, slamming them onto the table, causing the water pitcher to rattle. "Then whose are they?" she screamed. "If they weren't his, whose are they?" "The bank gave us loans based on his assets. The auditors saw the books. He was worth $500 million. You are trying to steal it. You and this old man are trying to steal my money." Mr. Sterling stood up, his face pale. "Mrs. King, if your husband did not own the collateral you pledged for your loan, then we have a very serious problem. That is fraud." "Shut up, Sterling," Tiffany yelled, not looking at him. "I am talking to the lawyer. If Dante didn't own it, who did? Who is the secret owner? Is it some shell company? Is it some offshore trust? Tell me his name. I will sue him. I will sue everyone in this room." Thurgood looked at me. He nodded slightly, giving me the floor. I cleared my throat. The sound was small, but in that quiet room it sounded like thunder. I gripped my cane and stood up slowly, wincing as my bad knee took the weight, but standing tall. Nonetheless, I looked at Tiffany, looking past the white suit and the diamonds, looking straight into the dark void of her greed. "You asked who owns it, Tiffany," I said, my voice steady, deep and resonant. "You asked whose name is on the deed." She stared at me, her eyes wide, her mouth open slightly, unable to comprehend what was happening. "It wasn't a shell company," I said, walking slowly toward the head of the table. "It wasn't an offshore trust, and it certainly wasn't Dante." I reached into my inside pocket and pulled out a worn leather notebook. It was my engineering journal, the one she had kicked across the floor the night she evicted me. I placed it on the table next to the will. "Dante was a good boy," I said softly. "He was a brilliant coder. But he didn't build the engine, he didn't design the propulsion system, and he didn't buy the land that house sits on." Tiffany backed away from me, shaking her head. "No," she whispered. No, that is not possible. You are just a retired mechanic. You are nobody. I opened the journal, revealing the original sketches of the KingTech turbine dated 20 years ago. Sketches signed with a signature she had seen 1,000 times but never understood. I am not nobody. Tiffany, I said. I looked at Thurgood and he handed me the final document, a yellowed piece of parchment that had been locked in a safe deposit box for 2 decades. Thurgood stood up and addressed the room, his voice ringing with the finality of a judge. The true owner of the King estate, the holder of all KingTech patents and the sole proprietor of the assets in question, is the man standing before you, Augustus King. Tiffany let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She looked at me, and the reality of her situation crashed down on her like a collapsing building. She realized that for the last week she had been spitting in the face of the only man who could save her. She realized that every insult, every slur, every act of cruelty had been directed at the landlord of her life. "You," she whispered, horror flooding her eyes. "It was you the whole time." I looked at her coldly. "Yes, Tiffany, it was me. And you just evicted the owner." The yellowed piece of paper lying on the mahogany table looked insignificant. It was just a standard incorporation document, the kind filed in city clerks' offices every day. The edges were frayed and the type was from an old dot matrix printer fading into gray. But in that room, surrounded by people holding their breath, that piece of paper had the weight of a death sentence. It was the document that bridged the past to the present, and it was the document that was about to sever Tiffany from her future. Thurgood picked it up, handling it with the reverence one might show a religious artifact. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Tiffany, who was sitting frozen in her chair, her face a mask of disbelief. She was still shaking her head, a small, repetitive motion, as if she could deny the reality unfolding in front of her. "Read it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Read it, and tell me it is a lie. Tell me. Dante didn't trick me." Thurgood didn't look at her. He looked at the document. "This is the original Articles of Incorporation for KingTech Aerosystems dated 22 years ago." Thurgood began, his voice filling the room. "It details the equity structure of the company at its inception. Please listen closely to Clause 4, Paragraph A." He cleared his throat and read the words that changed everything. "All intellectual property patents, physical assets, and future equity of KingTech are the sole property of the principal founder, Augustus King. The individual known as Dante King shall serve as the chief executive officer and public representative of the entity, acting as a nominee for the principal founder. In exchange for these services, Dante King shall receive an annual salary of $1 plus living expenses to be determined by the principal." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving a vacuum where only shock could exist. $1, Kyle blurted out, breaking the tension. He let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. $1? You mean to tell me the guy was working for tips? He was the CEO, he was on TV, he drove a Ferrari, and he made $1 a year. Turned to look at Kyle, my eyes cold. "He didn't drive a Ferrari," I said softly. "He drove my Ferrari. He lived in my house, and he spent my money because I allowed him to." Tiffany finally found her voice. It started as a low growl and erupted into a scream. "That is insane," she yelled, slamming her hand on the table. "You expect a judge to believe this? You expect the world to believe that Dante King, the genius behind the quantum turbine, was just a puppet, that he was just an employee?" "He wasn't a puppet," I said, walking slowly toward the window, looking out at the city skyline. "He was a shield." I turned back to face them, letting the cane rest against my leg. I needed them to understand not just the legal reality, but the history, the pain, the sacrifice that had built the ground they were standing on. 20 years ago I began. I was 52 years old. I had just developed the prototype for the variable cycle engine, the technology that powers half the military jets in the sky today. It was revolutionary, it was efficient, and it was mine. I spent nights in my garage drawing blueprints by hand, calculating thrust ratios until my eyes burned. I paused, remembering the smell of oil and coffee in that garage, Remembering the hope I felt, I took that design to every venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. I walked into boardrooms wearing my best suit, carrying my models, ready to change the world. And do you know what happened, Tiffany? She stared at me, saying nothing, her breathing ragged. They didn't see the engine. I said. My voice was hard now, edged with the bitterness of those memories. They saw a 50-year-old black man with grease under his fingernails. They saw a mechanic. They asked me who I stole the designs from. One man threw my business plan in the trash in front of me and asked me to bring him a coffee. He didn't think I was the inventor. He thought I was the help. I looked at Mr. Sterling, the banker. He was looking down at his hands, ashamed, or maybe just terrified of the lawsuit coming his way. The world wasn't ready to give Augustus King $100 million. I continued, but I couldn't let the technology die. It was too important. So I made a choice. A choice a father makes to ensure his family survives. I looked at the picture of Dante that Tiffany had placed on the table earlier, a prop for her performance. Dante was 22, I said softly. He was fresh out of MIT. He was brilliant, yes, but he wasn't an engineer. He was a talker. He was charismatic. He had a smile that could light up a room. And most importantly, he could walk into those rooms where I was invisible and people would listen to him. He was young, he was light-skinned, and he spoke the language of the new money, so we made a deal. I founded the company in the shadows, I kept the ownership, I kept the control, but I put Dante Represents face on the brochure. I made him the CEO. I let him take the credit. I let him take the interviews. I let him be the genius. Tiffany was shaking her head, tears of rage streaming down her face. You used him, she hissed. You used your own son as a front. I protected him, I roared. The sound of my voice made her jump back. I gave him a life he could never have dreamed of. I gave him the cars, the clothes, the respect of the world. All I asked in return was loyalty. All I asked was that he protect the legacy, and he did. Until he met you. I walked back to the table and picked up the yellow document. Dante knew the truth, I said. He knew that every cent in his account was an allowance from me. He knew that the house belonged to the trust. He knew that he was the caretaker, not the king. That is why he couldn't leave you the money, Tiffany. He couldn't give you what wasn't his to give. He wrote that will under duress, hoping that I would step in, hoping that the real owner would come back to claim his property and the $1 salary. Thurgood added, his voice cutting in sharply. That was Dante Represents' idea. It was a tax strategy, yes, but it was also a symbol. He wanted to remind himself every year that his true wealth didn't come from a paycheck. It came from his father. Tiffany looked at the document again. Her eyes were scanning the lines, looking for a loophole, looking for a way out. But there was none. The language was clear, precise, and ironclad. So, she whispered, her voice trembling so badly the words were barely intelligible. So everything, the stocks, the accounts, the house, it is all mine, I finished simply. The reality of it hit her like a physical blow. She slumped back in her chair, her white suit suddenly looking like a costume from a play that had been canceled. She looked at her hands, the hands that wore diamond rings, bought with my money, and she started to hyperventilate. And the loans. She gasped, clutching her chest. The $5 million I borrowed, the money I spent on the stocks. Mr. Sterling stood up then. He looked pale, sick. He knew that his career was likely over, Mrs. King. Sterling said, his voice tight. If the collateral you pledged the inheritance does not exist, then the loan is unsecured. And since you signed a personal guarantee creating a liability based on fraudulent representation. Fraud, Tiffany shrieked, turning on him. It wasn't fraud. I thought I owned it. He told me I owned it. Ignorance of the law is not a defense, Thurgood said calmly. You spent $5 million. You didn't have betting on an inheritance. You didn't deserve. And now the bill is due. I looked at Kyle. He was standing by the door, his hand on the knob. He looked like a rat sensing the ship going down. He looked at Tiffany, then at me, then at the door. Hey, look, he said, his voice cracking. I didn't sign anything. I was just hanging out. I didn't know she was broke. He opened the door and slipped out, disappearing into the hallway, leaving the woman he claimed to love drowning in a sea of debt. Tiffany watched him go, and for a second I saw the heartbreak in her eyes. The realization that she had sold her soul for a man who wouldn't even stay for the credits. but I didn't feel sorry for her. I remembered the way she had stomped on my son represents model airplane. I remembered the way she had threatened to flush his ashes. "You are not just broke, Tiffany," I said, walking over to stand directly in front of her. "You are worse than broke. You are in debt to a level you cannot comprehend. You owe the bank $5 million. You owe the estate for every penny you spent from the corporate account since Dante died. And you owe me for the pain you caused my son." I leaned down close enough to see the fear in her pupils. "Dante tried to protect you," I whispered. "He tried to warn you. He wrote that second will to give you a chance to be decent, a chance to show that you loved him and not just the money, but you couldn't do it. You had to be greedy. You had to be cruel. And now you are going to learn what it feels like to be truly empty." Tiffany looked up at me, and for the first time the arrogance was gone, replaced by the terrified look of a child who realizes the monster in the closet is real. "Dad," she whimpered, using the word she had refused to say for years. "Dad, please help me. I can't pay that money. They will put me in jail." I stood up straight, adjusting my cufflinks. I looked at Thurgood. "Is the police officer waiting outside, Thurgood?" Thurgood nodded. "Yes, the Economic Crimes Division." "Send him in," I said. I turned my back on Tiffany as she began to scream, begging, pleading, promising to change. But I wasn't listening. I was looking at the yellow paper on the table, the paper that proved that while the world may judge a man by the color of his skin, power recognizes only one thing: ownership. And I had ownership. And I owned them all along. The math in the conference room had changed instantly and violently. In the span of 5 minutes, Tiffany had gone from believing she was worth $500 million to realizing she was worth absolutely nothing. But she was about to learn a lesson that every engineer knows deep in their bones: zero is not the bottom. There are numbers below zero, dark, cold numbers that can drown you just as surely as the ocean. And Tiffany was standing at the edge of the deepest trench of all. Thurgood adjusted the papers on the table, pushing the yellowed articles of incorporation to the side. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a binder that was black, thick, and ominous. He placed it in front of Tiffany. The sound it made hitting the table was heavy, like a shovel hitting the earth on a grave. "What is that?" Tiffany whispered, wiping the mascara from her cheeks with the back of her hand. Is that the money? Is there a trust fund or a life insurance policy? Something Dante left just for me." Thurgood opened the binder. The pages were red, not the paper itself, but the ink. Column after column of negative numbers stretching down the page like scratches on a prison wall. "This," Thurgood said, his voice devoid of sympathy, "is the liability ledger of Dante King. You see, Mrs. King, while the assets of the company and the estate belong to Augustus, the debts incurred by Dante in his personal capacity belong to his estate. And since you are the sole beneficiary of his personal estate, you inherit everything that belongs to him, including his obligations." Tiffany looked at the page, squinting as if the numbers were in a foreign language. "Debts," she stammered. But he was rich. We lived in a mansion. We flew private. How can there be debts?" "You lived the lifestyle of a billionaire," Thurgood corrected. "But you did it on a salary of $1 a year plus a very generous allowance from his father. But that wasn't enough for you, was it? Mrs. King, you wanted more. You forced him to leverage his personal credit. You forced him to take out lines of credit against his future earnings that will never materialize now." Thurgood ran his finger down the list, reading the items aloud, his voice sounding like a judge reading a verdict. "Item 1, American Express, Centurion Card. Outstanding balance, $1.2 million. Charges include private jet charters to Saint-Tropez, couture clothing from Paris, and a diamond collar for a dog that does not exist. Item 2, personal line of credit from Chase Bank, $4 million, used to pay for the remodel of the East Wing. The remodel you ordered, Mrs. King. The one where you tore out the library. Item 3, gambling. Debts owed to various casinos in Las Vegas signed for by Dante King, but incurred by a guest registered as Kyle Evans. Total, outstanding $850,000. Tiffany gasped, looking at the empty chair where Kyle had been sitting just moments ago. "He told me he won," she whispered. "He told me he broke the house." Thurgood ignored her, continuing the relentless inventory. Item 4. The yacht deposit. Non-refundable. $1 million borrowed from a high-interest private lender, due immediately. Thurgood closed the binder and looked at her over his spectacles. The total personal debt of Dante King stands at roughly $7 million. Since the estate has zero assets because the house and company belong to Augustus, the estate is insolvent. However, because you signed joint liability agreements on the credit cards and personal guarantees on the loans, these debts are now yours. Mrs. King, congratulations. You didn't inherit a fortune. You inherited a whole $7 million. And deep. Tiffany sat there, stunned, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for mercy, for a bailout, for the old man to step in and fix it like I always did. "Dad," she whimpered, "you can pay this. You have the company. It is nothing to you. Please don't let them bankrupt me." I looked at her, keeping my face hard. I could pay it. Yes, I could write a check right now and clear the ledger without blinking. But that would not be justice. That would be enabling. And I was done enabling the destruction of my family. Dante incurred those debts trying to buy your love. "Tiffany," I said quietly, "he bought you the world, hoping you would smile at him just once, and you repaid him by stomping on his heart. You bought that debt with your greed. Now you own it. But the $7 million was just the beginning. The real catastrophe was standing in the corner wiping sweat from his forehead with a silk handkerchief." Mr. Sterling, the banker, had been listening intently, realizing that his career was hanging by a thread. He had lent Tiffany $5 million of the bank. Represents money based on collateral that didn't exist. That is a career-ending mistake unless he fixed it immediately. Sterling stepped forward, his nervousness replaced by the cold, predatory instinct of a man trying to survive. He pulled out his phone and typed a quick message. Then he looked at Tiffany, Mrs. King. Sterling said, his voice sharp, clipping the ends of his words. "We have a problem. The $5 million loan I authorized this morning was contingent on the inheritance. Since there is no inheritance, the loan is technically unsecured and based on fraudulent information. You claimed assets you did not have. That is bank fraud, Mrs. King, federal bank fraud." Tiffany stood up, knocking her chair over again. "I will pay you back," she screamed. I will get a job. I will sell the jewelry. Just give me time. Time is a luxury you do not have," Sterling snapped. "The funds were transferred to your brokerage account an hour ago. I am freezing that account now, recovering the cash. But there are fees. There are penalties. And there is the matter of the interest. And frankly, Mrs. King, looking at your liquidity profile, I don't trust you to leave this room with anything of value." Sterling pressed a button on his phone. "Send them in," he said. The doors to the conference room opened again. But this time, it wasn't police. It wasn't lawyers. Two large women walked in wearing dark blazers with the Bank Represents logo on the pocket. They were asset recovery specialists, repo agents in business suits. They moved with a terrifying efficiency, blocking the exit. "What is this?" Tiffany asked, backing away until she hit the wall. "What are you doing?" Mr. Sterling pointed a shaking finger at her. "We are seizing collateral. Mrs. King, the loan agreement you signed gives the bank the right to seize any personal property in your possession to offset the debt if fraud is suspected. And I suspect a great deal of fraud." "Take it," Sterling ordered. The two women moved in. The first one, a woman with a face like stone, reached for the Hermes Birkin bag sitting on the table, the one Tiffany had thrown down so arrogantly when she walked in. "No," Tiffany shrieked, lunging for the bag. "That is mine. It cost $50,000. You can't take that." The woman blocked Tiffany with a stiff arm, grabbing the bag with the other. "That is bank property now. Step back." The second woman stepped up to Tiffany, eyeing the diamond necklace sparkling around her neck. The necklace that had belonged to my wife, the necklace Tiffany had stolen from the safe the day Dante died. "Please remove the jewelry, Ma," the woman said, holding out a velvet bag. Tiffany covered her neck with her hands, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Augustus," she begged, "help me. They are mugging me. They are stealing. Beatrice's necklace. You can't let them take your wife's necklace." I leaned forward, resting my weight on my cane. "That necklace never belonged to you, Tiffany," I said coldly. "You took it without asking. You wore it to a funeral where you disrespected her son. Give it back." Tiffany shook her head, clutching the diamonds. "No, it is all I have left. It is my safety net." The recovery agent didn't wait. She reached out and with practiced dexterity unclasped the necklace from behind. Tiffany represents neck. It slid off her skin like water pooling into the agent, represents hand. Tiffany let out a sob, a sound of pure loss as if a limb had been removed. "The ring," the agent said, pointing to the massive 3-carat solitaire on Tiffany represents finger, the one Dante bought you last year, the one charged to the American Express card. Tiffany looked at the ring, twisting it on her finger, refusing to take it off. "It is stuck," she lied. "It won't come off." The agent produced a small bottle of lotion from her pocket. "We can help with that." "Ma-am." It took 3 minutes. 3 minutes of humiliating struggle of Tiffany crying and pulling while the women worked the ring off her finger. When it finally popped off, Tiffany slumped against the wall, holding her bare hand, looking at the white tan line where the diamond used to be. "The watch," Sterling said, pointing to her wrist. "The Rolex. Take that too." They stripped her. They took the bag, the necklace, the ring, the watch, the earrings. They even took the designer sunglasses she had perched on her head. They placed everything into evidence bags, tagging them, cataloging the debris of her vanity. Sterling looked at the pile of luxury goods on the table. "It won't cover the interest," he muttered, "but it is a start." He turned to Tiffany, who was now standing there stripped of her armor, looking small and ordinary in her white suit. "Mrs. King," Sterling said, "we will be filing a lien against your car and any other physical property you have in the apartment. The bank will be conducting a full audit of your spending. If we find that you transferred any loan money to Mr. Evans or anyone else, we will be filing criminal charges for embezzlement." Tiffany slid down the wall, sitting on the floor of the conference room, hugging her knees. She looked at the empty table where the millions used to be. She looked at the door where Kyle had walked out. She looked at me. "I am broke," she whispered to the floor. "I am negative. I have nothing." I walked over to her, the sound of my cane heavy in the quiet room. I looked down at the top of her head, at the blonde roots that were starting to show. "You have your life, Tiffany," I said. "You are young, you are healthy, you have 2 hands, and for the first time in your life you are going to have to use them." I turned to Thurgood. "Are we finished here?" I asked. Thurgood nodded, closing the black binder of debts. "We are finished. The eviction notice for the apartment across the street has already been served." "She has until sunset to vacate?" I looked at Tiffany one last time. She wasn't the queen anymore. She wasn't the predator. She was just a number, a negative number in a ledger that had finally been balanced. "Goodbye, Tiffany." I said I walked out of the conference room, leaving her sitting on the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of the things she thought she owned. I walked into the hallway and pressed the button for the elevator. When the doors opened, I stepped inside, and as they closed, I let out a breath I had been holding for 3 years. The weight was gone. My son represents name was clear, and the debt was paid, not with money, but with justice. The elevator ride down from the 42nd floor was usually a smooth, silent experience, a testament to modern engineering. But today, it felt like a descent into the inferno. Tiffany had managed to scramble into the car just before the doors closed, desperate to catch Kyle, who was staring at the floor, indicator numbers as if they were the combination to a safe he couldn't crack. The air in the small, metal box was thick with the smell of her panic and his cologne, a nauseating mix of desperation and cheap ambition. I stood in the corner, leaning on my cane, silent and invisible, watching the final act of their tragic romance play out. When the doors opened into the marble lobby of the Guardian building, Kyle bolted. He walked fast, his long legs eating up the distance toward the revolving glass doors and the freedom of the street. Tiffany ran after him, her heels clicking frantically on the polished stone, slipping slightly, losing her balance, but catching herself. She grabbed the sleeve of his jacket, pulling him to a stop right in front of the security desk where a guard looked up from his monitor, startled by the commotion. "Kyle, wait!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Please stop running away. We need to talk. We need a plan." Kyle spun around, ripping his arm from her grasp with such force that Tiffany stumbled back. "You need a plan," he shouted, not caring who heard him. "I need a lawyer. You heard what they said up there, Tiffany? $7 million in debt, federal fraud charges, embezzlement investigation. I am not part of this. I am just a guy who likes to play golf. I didn't sign those papers. But you spent the money. Tiffany sobbed, reaching for him again, her hands shaking. You spent the cash I took out on the credit cards. The trips, the clothes, the gambling debts. Kyle, you owe the casinos $800,000. You can't just leave me with that. Kyle laughed, a harsh barking sound that lacked any warmth. Oh, watch me leave. You think I am going to pay that? You are the one who gave me the card, Tiffany. You are the one who wanted to show off. You wanted a trophy boyfriend. Well, guess what? Trophies are expensive. And now that you are broke, you can't afford the maintenance fees. He turned to walk away, but she threw herself in front of him, blocking his path to the revolving door. She looked pathetic. Her white suit rumpled. Her makeup smeared her face, a mask of absolute terror. She wasn't fighting for love, she was fighting for survival. She knew that without Kyle, without a partner in crime, she was just a lonely woman facing a prison sentence. We can fix this, she pleaded, grabbing his lapels, pulling him close. We can sue the old man. We can say the will is fake. We can fight it. Kyle, please, I love you. Don't you love me? You said we were soulmates. Kyle looked down at her, and for the first time I saw the mask completely slip. There was no charm left, no fake smile, no seduction. There was only the cold, hard stare of a grifter who realizes the mark is dry. Love, he scoffed, pushing her hands off his chest. Are you kidding me? Tiffany, look at yourself. You are a mess. You are a 30-year-old widow with negative equity. I didn't love you. I loved the lifestyle. I loved the jet. I loved the house. But now the house belongs to your father-in-law, and the jet is probably being repossessed right now. You are radioactive. Tiffany, if I stay with you, I go down with you, and I don't do. Prison orange does not look good on me. He shoved her aside, not gently. He pushed her with enough force that she fell against the security desk, knocking over a vase of decorative flowers, water spilling onto the marble floor. I am done, he said, adjusting his jacket, smoothing out the wrinkles she had made. I am going to Vegas, maybe catch a flight to Mexico. Good luck with the feds. He started to walk toward the door again, but then he stopped. He looked down at his left wrist. The light from the lobby windows caught the gold casing of the Patek Philippe. The watch I had given Dante. The watch Kyle had stolen off a corpse and worn like a prize. He stared at it for a second, a look of calculation on his face. He knew it was valuable. He knew he could pawn it for maybe $20,000 or $30,000, enough to buy a ticket out of the country. But he also remembered what Thurgood had said upstairs. The assets of the estate belonged to Augustus King. If he walked out with that watch, he wasn't just leaving a girlfriend. He was committing grand larceny. And Kyle, for all his stupidity, was a survivor. He let out a curse under his breath, fiddling with the clasp. I don't want this cursed thing anyway, he muttered. It probably has your bad luck all over it. He unlatched the heavy gold band. The watch came free, sliding into his palm. He weighed it in his hand, feeling the heft of the craftsmanship, the heartbeat of the mechanism inside. Then he turned back to Tiffany, who was still slumped against the desk, weeping. Hey, fraud, he shouted. Tiffany looked up, her eyes blurry with tears. You said you were rich, Kyle yelled, his voice dripping with contempt. You said you owned the city. You are nothing but a liar and a thief. Here, take your trash back. He didn't hand it to her. He threw it. He hurled the Patek Philippe at her with a violent overhand motion. The watch spun through the air, a blur of gold and crystal. It missed. Tiffany represents head by inches and struck the marble floor with a sickening clatter, skidded across the polished stone, spinning wildly until it came to rest at the feet of a bronze statue near the elevators. The sound of the watch hitting the floor was like a gunshot to my heart. I flinched, physically, pained by the disrespect. My son represents legacy, treated like garbage tossed aside by a man who wasn't fit to shine. Dante represents shoes. Tiffany didn't even look at the watch. She was staring at Kyle, watching his back retreat through the revolving doors, watching him step out onto the busy sidewalk and disappear into the crowd. He didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. He walked away from her as easily as he would walk away from a bad hand of poker, leaving her with the debt and the shame. Tiffany sat there on the wet floor, surrounded by spilled flower water and the ruins of her life. She put her face in her hands and howled a sound of pure animal misery. It wasn't the cry of a grieving wife. It was the cry of a narcissist who realizes the mirror has shattered. I stood in the corner, witnessing it all. I felt a strange hollowness inside. The victory I had planned, the vengeance I had engineered was complete. She was destroyed, but seeing her there, broken and abandoned, I didn't feel joy. I felt the heavy burden of the truth that greed destroys everything it touches. I tapped my cane on the floor and began to walk across the lobby. My steps were slow, deliberate, echoey in the cavernous space. I walked past Tiffany. I didn't stop to offer a hand. I didn't stop to offer a tissue. She had made her bed and now she had to lie on the cold, wet floor of it. I walked straight to the bronze statue. I looked down. The watch was lying face down on the cold stone. My heart hammered in my chest as I bent down my bad knee protesting, but I ignored the pain. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. I turned it over. The crystal was sapphire scratch resistant. Thank God, it was unbroken. The face was still pristine, the hands still ticking, marking the time, marking the end of the war. Turned it over to look at the back. There was the inscription, faint but legible. To Dante, my North Star loved Dad. I pulled a white linen handkerchief from my breast pocket, the one I always carried, the one Beatrice had embroidered with my initials. I wiped the watch gently, cleaning off the dust of the floor, cleaning off the sweat of the man who had stolen it, cleaning off the taint of their greed. I polished the gold until it shone under the lobby lights, warm and true. I brought the watch to my lips and kissed the metal, closing my eyes. I am sorry it took so long, son, I whispered into the silence of the lobby. I am sorry you had to go through that. But it is over now. It is clean. I slipped the watch into my pocket, feeling its weight against my chest, right next to my heart. It felt like a piece of Dante had returned to me. I turned to look at Tiffany one last time. She had stopped howling. She was looking at me, her mascara running down her face in black rivulets, making her look like a tragic clown. She saw me put the watch in my pocket. She saw the care with which I handled it. He left me, she whispered, her voice hoarse. He took everything, and he left me. No, Tiffany, I said, my voice calm, echoing in the stillness. He didn't take everything. He took what he could get, and he left you with what you deserve. The emptiness. I adjusted my hat and turned toward the door. The item has returned to its owner, I said. I walked out of the building into the bright midday sun, leaving her there on the floor, waiting for the police, waiting for the consequences, waiting for a rescue that would never come. The watch ticked steadily in my pocket, a heartbeat that would never stop counting the cost of betrayal. The revolving doors of the Guardian building spun slowly, but they were not admitting clients or businessmen this time. Through the thick glass of the lobby walls, I could see the street outside transforming into a sea of flashing blue and red lights. It looked like a disco for the damned police cruisers. Were mounting the curb, blocking the exits, and unmarked federal sedans were screeching to a halt, their tires smoking against the asphalt. Tiffany was still on the floor, weeping over the space where her boyfriend had stood, but the sound of the sirens made her head snap up. The vibration of the heavy vehicles outside seemed to shake the marble beneath our feet, rattling the bones of the building. I stood near the bronze statue, my hand resting over the pocket where my son's watch lay warm and safe. I watched as the doors opened and a phalanx of officers marched in. These were not the beat cops who handle noise complaints. These were agents from the Economic Crimes Division wearing windbreakers, emblazoned with federal letters and carrying the weight of the United States government on their shoulders. They moved with a terrifying synchronization, their eyes scanning the lobby until they locked onto the woman in the dirty white suit. Lead Agent Miller, a man with a face carved from granite, walked straight past the security desk. He didn't look at the grandeur of the architecture. He didn't look at me. He looked only at the target. He stopped 3 feet from Tiffany, looking down at her with the dispassionate gaze of an exterminator, looking at a pest. Tiffany scrambled backward, her heels scraping against the polished floor until her back hit the reception desk. She looked wild, her hair coming loose from its pins, her makeup smeared into a mask of tragedy. She looked at the agents. Then she looked at me, her eyes wide with a new kind of panic. It wasn't the panic of being broke. It was the panic of a caged animal realizing the hunter has arrived. Tiffany King, Agent Miller said, his voice booming in the cavernous lobby. You are under arrest. Tiffany let out a strangled laugh, shaking her head frantically. Arrest? For what? I didn't do anything. My accounts are frozen. You already took my money. What more do you want? Agent Miller didn't blink. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a warrant, unfolding it with a snap that echoed like a pistol shot. You are being charged with 18 counts of wire fraud and bank fraud related to the falsification of loan documents. Miller read his tone flat and official. But that is just the beginning. Mrs. King, we are also charging you with grand larceny and the theft of intellectual property. Theft. Tiffany shrieked, pulling herself up, using the desk for support. I didn't steal anything. I was the wife. Everything was mine. Miller looked at me for a split second, a nod of acknowledgement, then turned back to her. According to the evidence provided by Mr. Augustus King and the legal counsel of King Tech Corporation, you executed the sale of classified guidance system patents to a foreign entity 3 days ago. You sold proprietary technology that did not belong to you, technology that is regulated by national security protocols for the sum of $2 million. You signed a bill of sale claiming ownership, knowing fully well those patents belong to the founder represents trust. That is not just theft, Mrs. King. That is corporate espionage and fraud on a federal level. I watched the color drain from her face completely, turning her skin the color of old ash. She remembered the blue folders. She remembered the liquidators in the office. She remembered selling my son represents life. Worked to buy a yacht she would never sail. She thought it was just paper. She didn't realize she was selling the keys to the kingdom, and Miller continued stepping closer. There is one more charge. A charge that comes directly from the district attorney's office. Based on witness testimony, video surveillance, and digital records, you are charged with elder abuse and endangerment of a dependent adult. Tiffany gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Elder abuse, she whispered. I never hit him. I never touched him. You evicted a 72-year-old man with a documented heart condition from his primary residence, giving him less than 24 hours notice, Miller stated, counting the offenses on his fingers. You canceled his life, sustaining medical insurance, knowing he had no other means of coverage. You forced him into a position of financial destitute while misappropriating his family assets in the state of New York. Mrs. King, financial exploitation and medical neglect of a senior citizen is a felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence. Tiffany looked at me. Then, she looked at the cane in my hand. She looked at the scar on my neck. She realized that every petty act of cruelty, every moment she had laughed at my suffering, every time she had called me a burden, had been recorded, documented, and turned into a weapon against her. This is a mistake, she stammered, backing away until she had nowhere left to go. My father-in-law, he is fine. Look at him. He is standing right there. He is wearing a suit. He is fine. I am fine because I survived you, I said, my voice cutting through the air, low and dangerous. Not because you cared. Miller nodded to the 2 officers behind him. Cuff her. The officers moved in fast. There was no hesitation, no gentleness. They grabbed Tiffany, represents arms, pulling them behind her back forcefully. The angle was awkward, and I heard her shoulder pop. She screamed a high-pitched sound of pain and indignity that made the security guard look away. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was loud and mechanical. Click, click, click. It was the sound of a steel door slamming on her future. No. Tiffany yelled, thrashing against the officer's grip. You can't do this. I am Tiffany King. I am a widow. I am a victim. Put me down. You are hurting me. You are hurting yourself. Ma, one of the officers said, tightening the grip, forcing her to march toward the exit. They began to drag her across the lobby, her feet sliding on the marble, her expensive shoes losing traction. She was fighting them, kicking and screaming, losing every shred of dignity she had left. She looked like a child throwing a tantrum in a supermarket, but the stakes here were freedom and life. As they dragged her past where I was standing, she dug her heels in, forcing them to stop for a second. She turned her desperate, tear-streaked face toward me. Her eyes were pleading, searching for the man who had sat quietly at dinner for 5 years, searching for the man she used to mock, Dad. She screamed the word, tearing from her throat. Dad, please tell them to stop. I stood still, watching her. Dad, she sobbed, struggling against the cuffs, tears dripping off her chin onto the dirty white suit. I am sorry. Okay? I am so sorry. I messed up. I was grieving. I didn't mean to hurt you. We are family. Dad. I am your daughter-in-law. I was married to Dante. Doesn't that mean anything? Please don't let them take me to prison. I am scared, Dad. I am so scared." The lobby fell silent save for her ragged breathing and the distant sirens. The officers looked at me, waiting to see if I would intervene, waiting to see if the old man represent's heart would soften for the crying woman calling him father. I looked at her deeply. I looked past the tears, past the fear, and I looked for the woman who had stomped on the model airplanes. I looked for the woman who had threatened to flush my son, represents ashes. I looked for the woman who had left me to die without medicine. I took a step closer, the tap of my cane echoing. I leaned in so she could see the absolute clarity in my eyes. "I don't have a daughter," I said calmly. Her face crumpled, the hope dying in her eyes instantly. "And you?" I continued, my voice rising just enough to carry the weight of the truth. "You are not my daughter-in-law. A daughter-in-law protects the family. A daughter-in-law honors the husband. A daughter-in-law does not sell his dreams for a boat and throw his father in the street, but I loved him." She whispered a weak, pathetic lie. "No," I said, shaking my head slowly. "You didn't love him. You consumed him. You were a mistake. Tiffany, you were the single greatest error in my son represents life. He was too kind to correct it. He was too gentle to see you for what you were. But Dante is gone now, and I am not gentle." I straightened up, looking at Agent Miller, taking a step back, signaling that I was done. "My son made a mistake when he married you," I said, my voice cold as ice, "and today I am fixing it. Take her away," I ordered. "No!" Tiffany screamed again as the officers yanked her forward, hauling her toward the revolving doors. "No, Augustus, please, you can't do this. I am family." I turned my back on her. I didn't watch her go through the doors. I didn't watch them shove her into the back of the federal cruiser. I didn't watch the flashbulbs of the press who had gathered outside capture her moment of ultimate shame. I just listened. I listened to her screams fading into the distance, getting smaller and smaller, until they were swallowed by the city. I stood there alone in the lobby of the building that bore the name of the bank she had tried to defraud. I felt a heavy weight lift off my shoulders, a weight I had been carrying since the day Dante brought her home. The cancer had been cut out. The surgery was brutal, and there was blood on the floor, but the patient, the legacy, was going to survive. Thurgood stepped out of the elevator, then carrying his briefcase, walking with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who knows the law has been served. He walked up to me and placed a hand on my shoulder. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He just squeezed my shoulder, a gesture of solidarity between two old men who had fought too many battles. "Is she gone?" Thurgood asked quietly. "She is gone," I said, touching the pocket where the watch lay and the charges. Everything I said, fraud, theft, abuse. She won't see the outside of a cell until she is old enough to understand what it means to be forgotten. Thurgood nodded, looking at the door. "It is a tragedy, Augustus, a waste of a life." "It was a tragedy a long time ago," Thurgood, I replied, turning to face him. "Now it is just a correction." I looked down at my hands, the hands she had called old and dirty. They were trembling slightly, but not from weakness. They were trembling from the adrenaline of justice. I closed them into fists, feeling the strength that was still there. "Let is go." "Thurgood," I said, "I have a company to run, and I have a son to apologize to." We walked out of the building together, not through the main doors where the circus was, but through the side exit into the quiet alleyway. The air was cool and smelled of rain. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean scent of freedom. The nightmare was over. The queen was dead and the king had returned to his throne. The drive to the cemetery was quiet, the kind of silence that usually follows a violent storm. Thurgood drove the black sedan, keeping the radio off, sensing that I needed the stillness to reassemble the scattered pieces of my soul. We wound our way out of the city, leaving the steel towers and the noise of the sirens far behind, until the landscape turned into rolling green hills dotted with white stone markers. This was the Eternal Rest Gardens, the place where I had buried my wife 10 years ago, and the place where last week I had watched my son being lowered into the ground while his murderers stood by and checked their phones. Thurgood parked the car at the bottom of the hill near the old weeping willow that marked the boundary of the King family plot. He turned off the engine and looked at me. His eyes were kind, tired, but filled with a deep understanding. "Do you want me to come up with you, Augustus?" he asked softly. I shook my head, reaching for my cane. "No, Thurgood. This is a conversation for a father and his son. I need to do this alone." I opened the door and stepped out onto the gravel path. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and cedar. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the grass that made the gravestones look like sundials counting down. The day I adjusted my coat, feeling the weight of the Patek Philippe watch in my breast pocket pressing against my ribs like a second heart. It was heavy, heavier than a watch should be because it carried the weight of a sin and the weight of redemption. I walked up the hill, my bad leg aching with every step, but I welcomed the pain. It kept me grounded. It kept me focused. I walked past the ornate mausoleums of the city, his old money, families past the fresh flowers on recent graves, until I reached the simple plot under the oak tree. There were 2 stones there. One was weathered gray granite marking the resting place of my wife Sarah. The other was fresh black marble, polished to a mirror shine. It was Dante, represents grave. I stood there for a long time just looking at his name carved into the stone. Dante, Marcus, king, beloved son, visionary. Tiffany had chosen the font. She had chosen the size. She had made sure his title was bigger than his name. Even in death, she wanted the world to know he was a CEO. But she was gone now, and all that was left was the stone and the silence. I sat down on the stone bench facing the grave. I rested my cane against my knee and took a deep breath, letting the peace of the place wash over me. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the watch. The gold caught the fading sunlight glinting with a warm fire. I held it in my hand, running my thumb over the smooth crystal. I thought about the day I bought it. I had saved for 5 years, putting away money from my consulting gigs, hiding it in a coffee can in the garage. I remembered giving it to him on his graduation day. The way his eyes had lit up, not because it was expensive, but because he knew what it cost me in sweat. I leaned forward and placed the watch gently on top of the headstone right above his name. The metal clicked softly against the stone, a sound of finality. "It is back where it belongs, son," I whispered to the grass. My voice cracked slightly, but I didn't stop. The thief is gone. The parasite has been removed. I took it back. Dante, I cleaned it. I wiped away his fingerprints. I wiped away the shame. It is yours again. A breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree, sounding like a sigh. I looked at the watch, ticking steadily, counting seconds that Dante would never see. And the guilt that I had been holding back, the guilt that had been hiding behind my rage, finally broke through the dam. "I am sorry, Dante," I said, my voice trembling, tears beginning to blur my vision. "I am so sorry. I wasn't apologizing for the watch. I was apologizing for the life I had designed for him. I made you a target," I said, speaking to the stone as if he were sitting right there next to me. 20 years ago, I thought I was being smart. I thought I was protecting the legacy. I knew the world wasn't ready to accept a black man as the inventor of the quantum turbine. I knew the banks would laugh at me. I knew the investors would shut the door, so I put you in front. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, the rough skin scraping against my cheek. "I made you the face," I continued. "I made you the CEO. I gave you the suit and the car and the office. I thought I was giving you a gift. I thought I was giving you the life I never had. But I was wrong, Dante. I didn't give you a gift. I gave you a shield. I used you as a shield to protect my work from the racism of the world." I looked at the grave, seeing the boy who used to follow me around the garage holding the flashlight. "And because you were the shield, you took the arrows," I said. "You took the pressure. You took the scrutiny. And worst of all, you attracted the sharks." Tiffany didn't see a man when she saw you, Dante. She saw a title. She saw the CEO. She saw the target. I painted on your back. If I had stood up, if I had claimed my own invention, she would have walked right past you. You would have been safe. You might have found a woman who loved you for your heart, not your checkbook. The realization washed over me, cold and absolute. My fear had killed my son. My fear of being rejected by the world had created the trap that caught him. I had built the engine, but I had put him in the cockpit without a parachute. I sat there weeping quietly, letting the grief flow out of me into the earth. It was a bitter lesson learned too late. An engineer can calculate stress loads and thermal dynamics, but he cannot calculate the human cost of a lie. I reached out and touched the cold stone, tracing the letters of his name. "You tried to warn me," I whispered. "You tried to tell me you were drowning in those video logs. You told me you were weak, but you weren't weak, son. You were the strongest man I ever knew. You carried my burden for 20 years. You protected my secret until your heart literally exploded. You died protecting me from her. You died so I wouldn't be disappointed." I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the cemetery. It smelled of rain and soil and eternity. "But I am done hiding. Dante," I said, my voice finding its strength again. "I am done being the shadow. The world is going to know who built the engine, not for my ego, but for your memory. I am going to step into the light. I am going to take back the company, and I am going to run it the way we talked about on those Sunday afternoons." I picked up the watch again, holding it tight in my fist. "I promise you this," I said fiercely, looking at the setting sun. "I will use every dollar, every patent, every ounce of power in that building to make sure your name means something real. I am going to build a school. Dante, a school for kids like us, kids who have the mind but not the money, kids who are invisible. I am going to give them the tools to build their own wings so they never have to be a shield for anyone else." I stood up, my knees popping, but holding firm. I placed the watch back on the stone, carefully positioning it so it faced the sky. "I am going to leave this here for a moment," said. "Just for a moment, let it soak up the peace. Then I am going to take it, and I am going to wear it. I am going to wear it to every board meeting, every negotiation, every ribbon cutting, and every time I look at the time, I will see you." I stood there for a moment longer, a solitary figure on the hill, watching the light fade from the sky. I felt a presence, a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. It felt like a hand on my shoulder, gentle and reassuring. "You can rest now, son," I whispered. "The work is done. The debt is paid, and the king is back on the throne." I turned and walked away from the grave, leaving the watch gleaming in the twilight. I didn't look back. I walked down the hill toward the waiting car, my cane tapping a steady rhythm on the path. Thurgood saw me coming and started the engine. The headlights cut through the gathering dusk, illuminating the road ahead. I opened the car door and slid into the seat, feeling the warmth of the heater. Thurgood looked at me, scanning my face for signs of collapse. But he didn't find any. He found a man who had left his guilt on the hill and picked up a mission. "Are you okay?" Augustus Thurgood asked quietly. I looked out the window at the dark silhouette of the oak tree guarding my family. "I am better than okay, Thurgood," I said, fastening my seatbelt. "I am ready. Take me to the office." "To the office?" Thurgood asked, surprised. "It is almost 7 o'clock. The building is closed." "Not for me," I said. My voice was calm, resolute. "The building is never closed for the owner. I have 20 years of work to catch up on." And Thurgood, "Call the janitorial staff." "The janitors?" Thurgood asked, pulling the car onto the main road. "Yes," I said, smiling a small, sad smile. "Tell them to meet me in the lobby. I want to learn their names. I want to know the people who actually clean the floors, because from now on in King Tech, nobody is invisible." As the car sped toward the city, toward the tower of glass and steel that held my legacy, I touched my chest, where my heart beat strong and steady. I wasn't just Augustus King anymore. I was the keeper of the flame, and the fire was just beginning to burn. The elevator doors to the penthouse office of King Tech opened with a soft chime, a sound I hadn't heard in 20 years. It was Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp. The sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The office was exactly as Dante had left it, sterile, cold, and filled with modern art that looked like spilled paint. But the atmosphere was different today. The air didn't smell of fear and cologne anymore. It smelled of coffee and consequences. I walked down the hallway, my cane tapping a steady rhythm on the polished concrete floor. Thurgood walked beside me, carrying a briefcase thick with termination notices. The staff was already gathered in the main conference room, the glass fishbowl where Tiffany used to hold her champagne toasts. They were huddled together, the vice presidents, the directors of marketing the brand, ambassadors, the entourage of sycophants who had helped Tiffany drain the company accounts while my son worked himself to death. They looked up as I approached, and the silence that fell over the room was absolute. I didn't sit at the head of the table. I stood there leaning on my cane, looking at them one by one. I saw Preston, the VP of marketing, who had approved the $2 million rebranding campaign while the R&D budget was cut. I saw Sarah, the director of communications, who had helped Tiffany spin the lie about Dante's health. I saw the leeches who had attached themselves to the host, and I felt the cold precision of an engineer looking at a rusted part. "Good morning," I said, my voice deep and filling the room. "My name is Augustus King. For 20 years you thought I was a ghost. You thought I was a silent partner or a senile old man. Well, the ghost is real, and he is holding the payroll." Preston cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive tie. "Mr. King," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "we are so glad you are taking a hands-on approach. We have some great ideas for the next quarter." Tiffany had suggested a new line of luxury merchandise to... I held up my hand and he stopped talking instantly. "Tiffany is in a federal holding cell," I said calmly, "and her ideas are currently limited to what she can buy at the commissary. We are not selling luxury merchandise, Preston. We are an engineering firm. We build engines. We build the things that make the world move. We do not build brands. We build legacies." I walked over to the whiteboard where a graph showed the company represents spending over the last year. The line for entertainment and marketing was a steep climb. The line for research and development was a flat line, a dead pulse. "This ends today," I said. I nodded to Thurgood. He opened his briefcase and began handing out envelopes, white, crisp, and final. He moved around the table like the angel of death, handing a letter to Preston, to Sarah, to the entire executive team that Tiffany had handpicked. "What is this?" Preston asked, opening his envelope and staring at the single sheet of paper inside. "It is a severance package," I said, generous enough to keep you from starving, but small enough to remind you that incompetence has a price. "You are fired, Preston. All of you fired," Sarah gasped, standing up. But you can't fire the whole executive team. Who will run the company?" I smiled a slow, genuine smile for the first time in weeks. "The people who actually do the work," I said. "The engineers, the coders, the machinists in the basement, who you haven't spoken to in 5 years, the people whose budgets you stole to pay for your launch parties. They will run the company. I will run the company. Now please clear your desks. You have 1 hour. Security will escort you out." I watched them leave a parade of expensive suits and shocked faces walking out of the glass fishbowl, dragging their egos behind them. They were the rust, and I had just scraped them off the machine. When the room was empty, I turned to Thurgood, calling the real meeting. The intercom buzzed, and moments later the room began to fill up again. But this time it wasn't suits. It was lab coats. It was coveralls. It was men and women with grease under their fingernails and tired eyes. The chief engineer, Maria, a woman I had hired 15 years ago, walked in looking hesitant. "Mr. King," she said, "do you want us to—" "Sit down, Maria," I said, pointing to the chair Preston had just vacated. "Sit down, everyone. This is your table now. I spent the next 3 hours doing what I love. I talked about torque ratios. I talked about thermal efficiency. I listened to the engineers tell me about the projects they had shelved because Tiffany wouldn't fund them. I saw the light come back into their eyes, the spark of innovation that had been smothered by greed. We weren't a fashion brand anymore. We were King Tech, and we were back in business. But rebuilding the company was only the first step. The second step was the promise I had made on the hill at the cemetery. At 2 o'clock, I walked down to the lobby. The press was there, a sea of cameras and microphones. They were hungry for a scandal. They wanted to hear about Tiffany, about the fraud, about the drama. But I wasn't going to give them a tabloid story. I was going to give them a revolution. I stood at the podium, the microphones bristling like a hedge of thorns. I adjusted my glasses and looked into the camera lenses. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steady. "You came here today to ask about the past. You want to know about the scandal, the theft, the betrayal. But I am not here to talk about the past. I am here to talk about the future." I signaled to Thurgood, who unveiled a large architectural rendering on the easel beside me. It was a drawing of a campus, modern and bright, with laboratories, classrooms, and workshops. "My son Dante King was a visionary," I said. "But before he was a visionary, he was a black boy in a garage who loved airplanes. He had a father who was an engineer, so he had a head start. But for millions of children in this country, children who look like me, children who come from neighborhoods that the world has forgotten, there is no garage, there is no head start, there is only a wall. I paused, letting the words sink in. Talent is distributed equally. I continued, but opportunity is not. Today, I am changing the equation. I pulled a check from my pocket. It wasn't a prop. It was a cashier represents check drawn from the recovered assets of the King estate and the liquidated luxury goods Tiffany had hoarded. "This is a check for $500 million, I said, holding it up for the cameras. The flashbulbs erupted a blinding storm of light. "I am not buying a yacht," I said, my voice rising over the noise. "I am not buying a private island. I am establishing the Dante King Engineering Academy. It will be a state-of-the-art facility located right here in the city, in the neighborhood where I grew up." I looked directly into the camera, addressing the parents watching at home, the ones who were working 2 jobs, the ones who were tired. "This academy will be free," I said. "Tuition free. Books free. Tools free. It is for the C students who work night shifts. It is for the dreamers who don't have the grades because they are too busy surviving. We will teach them coding, robotics, and aerospace engineering. We won't just give them a degree. We will give them a trade, a career, a life." I lowered the check, looking at the rendering of the school. "My son died trying to earn a fortune to please a woman who despised him," I said softly. "I am using that fortune to build an army of innovators who will change the world. This is his legacy, not the money, not the building, but the minds we are going to unlock." The room was silent for a heartbeat, and then it exploded. Not with questions, but with applause. The reporters, the cameramen, even the security guards were clapping. It wasn't polite applause. It was the sound of people recognizing something real in a world of fake. I stepped away from the podium and walked over to Maria, the chief engineer. "You are in charge of the curriculum, Maria," I said. "Make it hard, make it real. I want these kids to be able to build a rocket by the time they are 18. She nodded, tears standing in her eyes. "We will build them. Wings, Mr. King." I walked out of the lobby, leaving the noise behind. I walked out the back door into the alleyway where the janitors were taking their break. The same alleyway where I had escaped with Thurgood the day Tiffany was arrested. There was an old man there sitting on a milk crate smoking a cigarette. He looked up as I approached, eyeing my suit. "You the boss?" "Now?" he asked, squinting at me. I sat down on the crate next to him, resting my cane against the brick wall. "No," I said, taking a deep breath of the city air. "I am just the engineer. The boss is the work." He nodded, handing me a spare cigarette. I didn't smoke, but I took it, holding it like a baton. "Good to have a working man at the wheel," he said. I sat there for a long time, watching the smoke curl up toward the strip of blue sky between the buildings. I thought about Dante. I thought about the kids who would walk through the doors of his academy next year. I thought about the invisible people, the ones who hold the world up. Tiffany had wanted to be a queen. She had wanted a kingdom of gold, but she didn't understand the first rule of engineering. You don't build a kingdom from the top down, you build it from the bottom up. Foundation first, brick by brick. And as I sat there on the milk crate next to the janitor, listening to the hum of the city, I realized that for the first time in 20 years, the foundation was finally solid. The King estate wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a launch pad, and we were ready for takeoff.